It started as a simple weekend trip. I had been planning it for weeks, maybe even months, just in my head at first, thinking about getting away from the noise of the city, the never-ending deadlines, the buzz of people everywhere. I needed something quiet, something raw and real. Camping alone seemed like the perfect answer. Not the kind of camping where you have a bunch of gear and a fancy tent set up at a crowded campground with other families and kids screaming, but real camping. Deep in the woods, miles from roads and other people. Just me, my backpack, and the wilderness. I chose a spot that wasn't on any popular trail maps. Something tucked deep inside a national forest about 6 hours from my apartment. I had driven halfway the night before, slept in the car, and got up early to hike in. The trail was rough, overgrown, uneven, littered with dead branches and rocks. It was clear not many people used it. That's exactly why I liked it. Promised solitude. My pack was heavy but manageable. I brought enough food and water for 3 days, a sleeping bag rated for cold nights, a lightweight stove, some extra batteries, a first aid kit, and a map plus compass. I'm not inexperienced, having gone on many hikes before, but I hadn't done a solo overnight in a long time. The solitude excited me. The first day went smoothly. I moved slowly, savoring the quiet and the smells of pine and damp earth. Birds called sporadically. I passed small streams and patches of moss-covered rocks. Around mid-afternoon, I reached a small clearing surrounded by tall trees. It was perfect, flat ground, no visible deadfall, and a small creek nearby for water. I set up my tent quickly, made a simple dinner of freeze-dried chili, and watched the sun begin to dip behind the trees. That first night was cool but comfortable. I slept well, the sounds of the forest lulling me to sleep. The wind through the branches, the occasional snap of a twig, some distant owl calls. I felt calm, safe even. This was what I had wanted, peace. The next morning, I woke early, brewed some coffee on my stove, and decided to explore a bit before settling in for the day. The sun filtered through the canopy, casting sharp patterns of light and shadow on the forest floor. The woods felt alive but not threatening. I moved slowly and carefully, marking my path with small piles of stones so I could find my way back. I wandered maybe a mile from camp, following the creek upstream. The water was clear and cold, and small fish darted in the shallows. I stopped occasionally to fill my water bottles and take pictures with my phone. There was something primal and soothing about the place. It felt like stepping into a different world, one untouched by the busy modern life I was so used to. Around mid-morning, I came across something unexpected. A small campsite, abandoned but recent. There was a fire pit with cold ashes, a torn tent flap caught on a branch, some empty food wrappers scattered around. Nothing seemed dangerous, but the place was clearly not forgotten. Someone had been here not long ago. I felt a slight edge of nervousness but shook it off. People passed through the woods all the time, I told myself. Maybe they had left in a hurry, or maybe they moved on. I took a few photos for evidence, just in case, then headed back to my camp. Back at my tent, I checked my map and planned out the rest of the day. I decided to rest, read a bit, and then make a small fire after dark. The weather was clear and mild, with no signs of rain. The afternoon was uneventful until early evening. I gathered some firewood, careful to avoid anything wet or rotten, and built a modest fire pit near my tent. Sitting by the fire, I roasted some nuts and dried fruit, watching sparks rise into the night air. The sky was clear, stars bright and sharp. The forest was dark but comforting, filled with the usual nighttime sounds. That's when I first noticed the other sounds. At first, it was subtle. A distant crack of a branch, a low rustle of leaves, maybe an animal moving through the underbrush. But then it became more frequent, more distinct. It wasn't the usual forest animals. There was a pattern, something deliberate about the noise. Came from multiple directions, slow and cautious. I reminded myself that the woods were full of animals. Deer, raccoons, maybe coyotes, and I had no reason to be scared. But the noises felt off, as if something was watching me, moving around me. My skin prickled with unease. I packed up my fire quickly and zipped into my tent before it got too dark. I double-checked my knife and flashlight within arm's reach. I lay down, listening carefully. The noises continued, circling the tent, then fading. I told myself it was probably a bear or some other wild creature, but I didn't hear the typical grunts or growls, just the soft crunching of feet in leaves and twigs. I tried to sleep, but the tension made it difficult. Every little sound was amplified. Hours passed like this, me wide awake, gripping my flashlight. At dawn, I finally drifted off. The next day, I packed up the camp early. I felt like I shouldn't stay here anymore, but I was still curious about the abandoned campsite I'd found upstream. I decided to hike back there to investigate more thoroughly in daylight. The trail was muddy and slick from overnight dew. I moved carefully, stepping over roots and rocks. The forest felt different in the morning light, less menacing but more mysterious. When I reached the old campsite, I examined it in detail. The fire pit was cold and covered with leaves. I found a small backpack hidden behind some bushes. It was weathered but intact. Inside, there were a few supplies: an empty water bottle, a worn-out map, a lighter, and some scraps of paper. I unfolded the papers carefully. They were notes, written hastily in pencil. Some maps with markings, some warnings scrawled in hurried handwriting. The notes spoke about being followed, hearing footsteps at night, feeling watched. The writer seemed scared but never specified by what. I felt a chill. Someone had been here, scared enough to leave clues behind. I left the camp quickly and headed back toward my own site. When I arrived, I found the unexpected. My tent flap was open, the inside disturbed. My sleeping bag was pulled halfway out, my backpack unzipped. Nothing was missing, but it was clear someone or something had been inside. Panic rose in my chest. I scanned the perimeter, flashlight ready, but the woods were empty. No footprints other than mine. No signs of anyone else. I packed everything rapidly, deciding to leave immediately. As I descended the trail, I heard something running behind me. Branches snapping, heavy footsteps. I didn't look back, just kept moving as fast as I could. The trail was slippery, and I nearly fell several times, adrenaline keeping me upright. When I finally reached the forest road where I had parked my car, I sprinted the last 100 meters, heart pounding. I threw my pack inside, locked the doors, and started the engine. Driving away, I glanced in the rearview mirror into the dark woods. For a brief moment, I thought I saw a shadow watching me from the tree line, but when I blinked, it was gone. I didn't stop to think about it until much later. At home, I examined my gear, the disturbed tent, the notes from the other campsite, the feeling of being followed. None of it made sense. Who was out there? What were they doing? Days later, I reported the incident to the local ranger station. They took my information seriously and said they had received other reports of suspicious activity in the area. Unauthorized campers, some known to be involved in criminal behavior. It seemed that someone had been using that section of the forest to hide or run from the law. I understood then what I had really stumbled into. My simple camping trip had brought me close to people who didn't want to be found and who were willing to get close to anyone who crossed their path. I learned a lot from that trip about the wilderness, yes, but also about human nature. The woods can be peaceful and beautiful, but they also hide dangers much closer to home than any ghost story. I never went back to that spot again. I never thought a simple camping trip could turn into something I wouldn't forget for the rest of my life. I had always enjoyed the outdoors, the quiet, the smell of pine trees, the crackling of the campfire, and the way the stars lit up the night sky far from city lights. But what happened on that trip left a mark on me I can't shake. No ghosts, no monsters, just pure, raw reality, and it was terrifying in its own way. I planned the trip alone, something I had done before plenty of times. A few days out in the wilderness to clear my head, to disconnect from everything. No phone service, no internet, no distractions. I packed my gear carefully: tent, sleeping bag, enough food, water filter, first aid kit, map, compass, and all the basics. I even brought a small portable stove and a headlamp just in case. The place I picked was a national forest about 100 miles from the nearest town. The map showed a few trails, but I wanted to set up camp in a remote area away from marked paths. I liked the challenge and I liked the solitude. I left early in the morning, driving through winding roads flanked by thick forests. The air smelled fresh, cold even though it was early spring. When I arrived at the forest edge, I parked my car and started hiking on a little-used trail. The first few miles were easy, soft dirt underfoot, birds chirping, the occasional squirrel darting past. The trees were tall and dense, mostly pines and oaks, and the canopy overhead let just enough light through to keep the forest floor dim but not dark. I carried my backpack comfortably and kept a steady pace, knowing I needed to find a good spot before nightfall. After about 4 hours of hiking, I reached a small clearing by a narrow stream. The ground was flat, covered with a thick layer of pine needles, and surrounded by trees tall enough to block the wind. Perfect. I set up my tent there, using the small rocks and logs nearby to mark the perimeter and keep the rain fly taut. The sun was beginning to lower, and the forest started to cool. I gathered some dry wood and started a fire using my lighter and some dry tinder I'd collected earlier. The flames flickered, casting long shadows on the trees, and the crackle of the fire was a comforting sound. After cooking a simple dinner of canned beans and rice, I sat by the fire, sipping water and listening to the sounds around me. The rustling of leaves, the gurgle of the stream, the distant call of a hawk. The peacefulness was everything I wanted. As the light faded, I retreated to my tent to get ready for bed. I set the headlamp on low and wrote a few notes in my small journal about the day's hike and the beauty of the place. The air was crisp, and the smell of pine was stronger now. That's when I first noticed the sound. It was faint at first, a low, repetitive snapping noise coming from the woods beyond the clearing. I froze, straining to hear it better. It wasn't the normal cracking of branches under small animals' feet. It was more deliberate, heavier, like someone or something was moving carefully but steadily through the underbrush. I told myself it was probably a deer or some other wild animal, maybe a raccoon digging for food. I reminded myself I was alone and that most animals want nothing to do with humans. Still, the noise continued, slow and steady, sometimes stopping, then starting again. It felt like it was circling around the clearing. I grabbed my flashlight and shone the beam into the trees, scanning the darkness. Nothing moved. No eyes reflected in the light, no shapes. I decided to go to bed early, telling myself it was just the forest settling in for the night. I zipped up the tent, leaving a small flap unzipped just enough for fresh air. The fire had died down to glowing embers, and the cold was creeping in. I tried to fall asleep, but the snapping noises persisted, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away. My heart began to race when the sound suddenly stopped altogether. I sat up, listening intently. The silence was heavier than the noise had been. No wind, no animals, nothing but the quiet night. That's when I heard it. A low grunt, muffled and rough, coming from just outside the edge of the clearing. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent quickly, pointing the beam toward the noise. The light caught the outline of a large figure standing among the trees, tall, broad-shouldered, and hunched slightly. I couldn't see the face clearly, but I knew immediately this was not an animal. I froze. My mind raced. Who could be out here? Why would anyone be so close to my camp without making themselves known? I thought about shouting, but something held me back. The figure didn't move or make any other noise. It just stood there, watching. My pulse pounded in my ears. I reached for my pocket knife, the small one I always carried, gripping it tightly. I knew I couldn't outrun whoever or whatever this was in the dark woods. After what felt like minutes but was probably only seconds, the figure turned and disappeared silently into the trees. The snapping noises started again, fading as it moved away. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the dying embers of the fire, flashlight in hand, listening to every crack, every whisper of the wind. The forest felt alive, but not in the way I was used to. There was something else there, watching, waiting. In the morning, I packed up quickly. I didn't want to stay another night. As I hiked back to my car, my mind replayed the events over and over. Who was that figure? Was it a lost hiker? A hunter? Or something worse? When I reached my car, I locked the doors immediately and started the engine. On the drive home, I tried to calm down, telling myself it was just someone passing through, maybe a local woodsman. But the unease stayed with me for days after. I reported what I saw to the park rangers, hoping they could tell me if anyone had been in the area illegally or if there had been any reports of suspicious people. Weeks later, I read in the news about an arrest. A man had been caught hiding in the woods near that very forest. He was wanted for several crimes, including assault and robbery. The authorities said he had been living off the grid, hiding in the wilderness, and had been watching people coming in and out. I realized then how close I had come to something dangerous, something real and terrifying without needing any ghosts or monsters. The woods had always been a place of peace for me, but that trip taught me that danger can be very real. Hidden in the shadows, silent but deadly, waiting for the right moment. The forest was darker than I expected when I set up camp. I had arrived just after sunset, the last rays of daylight fading through thick branches overhead. I had been hiking for hours carrying my gear, tent, sleeping bag, stove, food, all on my back. I had planned this trip carefully, but nothing really prepared me for what was about to unfold. I chose a small clearing beside a narrow creek. The ground was soft with fallen leaves, and I found a relatively flat spot where I could pitch my tent. The air smelled like pine and wet earth. I was alone, or at least I thought I was. The nearest trail was a good 2 miles back, and I hadn't seen another person for hours. I felt comfortable, used to solo trips like this, enjoying the quiet away from people and noise. I worked quickly, setting up my tent and gathering firewood. The temperature was already dropping, and I knew the night would be cold. The sun disappeared, and the sky turned a deep indigo. I started a small fire, the kind that would burn low but warm enough for the night. As the fire crackled, I unpacked my food. A simple meal of canned beans and rice, easy to heat on the small stove. After eating, I cleaned up and placed the food container far from my tent, hoping to keep any curious animals away. I crawled into the tent, zipped the door shut, and lay down on my sleeping pad. Outside, the sounds of the forest surrounded me. Crickets, frogs, and the occasional snap of a twig. I felt calm, the kind of calm that comes from being alone in nature with nothing urgent on your mind. That calm didn't last. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. Something was wrong. I don't know exactly what woke me. Maybe it was the sharp crack of a branch breaking close by or the strange silence that suddenly fell over the woods. Whatever it was, it felt like the forest was holding its breath. I sat up slowly, listening. The fire was nearly out, only a few glowing embers left. I unzipped the tent a little, just enough to peek out. The moon was behind thick clouds, leaving the forest almost pitch black. I couldn't see far, but I thought I saw movement, something just beyond the trees. I froze. My heart beat hard against my ribs. I told myself it was probably a deer or a raccoon, but my gut said otherwise. I reached for my flashlight and turned it on, the beam cutting through the dark like a knife. I swept the light around the clearing, but I didn't see anything at first. Then, I caught a glimpse of a shadow moving behind a large pine tree at the edge of the clearing. The shadow was too big and too fast to be an animal. My breath caught in my throat. I knew people weren't supposed to be here, at least not this deep and this late. I turned off the flashlight and zipped the tent back up. I wanted to stay hidden. I listened hard, trying to catch any sounds, footsteps, voices, anything. But all I heard was the steady drip of water from the creek and the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I lay awake, clutching my small camping knife, eyes peeled for any sign of movement outside. The thought of someone else out here, moving silently in the dark, filled me with unease I couldn't shake. When dawn finally broke, the first light filtered through the trees, and I stepped out of the tent, eager for fresh air. I checked around the campsite and noticed something strange. Footprints. They were faint but definitely human. They circled the clearing, stopping just a few feet from my tent, then turning back into the woods. My mind raced. Who had been watching me? What did they want? I had no cell signal to call for help, and the nearest ranger station was miles away. I packed up my gear quickly, keeping my knife close and my eyes scanning the forest as I moved. I started hiking back toward the trailhead, but I couldn't shake the feeling I was being followed. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made me stop and look around. I didn't see anyone, but the footprints and shadows from the night stayed in my head. About halfway back, I found a broken branch lying on the path. It looked like someone had used it to hit the ground hard, maybe to warn me or to scare me. My heart pounded. I kept moving faster, my breathing ragged. I didn't want to look back, but I couldn't help it. I glanced over my shoulder and saw a figure standing between two trees, watching me. The figure didn't move. I couldn't make out details, just the shape, tall, thin, standing perfectly still. I forced myself to keep walking, trying not to panic. After a few minutes, I reached a clearing where the trail opened to a dirt road. A few cars were parked there, other hikers, I hoped. I moved toward them, relief washing over me. One of the hikers noticed me and came over. I told them I had been camping alone and something wasn't right. They said they hadn't seen anyone suspicious but agreed to walk with me to the ranger station. At the station, I reported the footprints and the figure I saw. The ranger told me people sometimes come into the woods with bad intentions. Maybe hunters, maybe someone trying to scare campers, or worse. They promised to send patrols to check the area. That night, safe in a nearby town, I thought about what happened. The forest was beautiful, but it had hidden dangers, not from ghosts or monsters, but from people. The fear wasn't from something unreal. It was real because I knew there were others out there who didn't belong. I learned that night to always trust my instincts and never underestimate the quietness of the woods. Sometimes the scariest thing isn't what you see, but what you know is watching, waiting in the dark. I had planned this camping trip for months. It was supposed to be a break, a chance to disconnect from everything and just spend a few days alone in the wilderness. No phone, no internet, no distractions. Just me, my gear, and the forest. I've done camping trips before, but this one was going to be different. I wanted to go farther and more remote than usual, deeper into the woods where few people go. The kind of place where you feel the silence and the isolation in your bones. I picked a spot in a national forest a few hours' drive from home, a place marked on old maps but not often visited. It was a stretch of dense pine trees and uneven ground, with a small creek running nearby. I'd studied the area on satellite images and topographic maps, noted the trails and landmarks, and packed carefully tent, sleeping bag, food, water purification tablets, a small stove, extra clothes, first aid kit, and the essentials. I wanted to be prepared but still keep my pack light. The drive there was uneventful, a long stretch of highway followed by bumpy dirt roads. I arrived just as the sun was beginning to lower, the golden light filtering through the trees like a slow drip of warmth. I parked in a small clearing and unloaded my gear. Setting up the tent took longer than I expected, my hands fumbling a bit with the unfamiliar poles and stakes in the growing shadows. But eventually, the tent stood solid and quiet. The first night was calm. I made a simple meal on my stove, the hiss of the flame and the smell of cooking food the only sounds. The creek nearby whispered softly in the dark. I lay inside the tent, the fabric pressed close around me, the forest outside alive but distant. I slept well, deep and uninterrupted. The next day, I decided to explore. I followed the creek upstream, my boots crunching on wet stones and mossy ground. The woods felt thick and old, trees standing tall and close, their branches tangled and heavy with needles. The light above was dim, filtered through layers of green. I noticed small animal tracks in the mud and broken twigs that showed signs of recent activity. I kept an eye out, alert but calm. As the afternoon passed, I climbed a small ridge where the trees thinned out, revealing a clearing with a view over the forest canopy. It was beautiful, endless green, rolling hills fading into a pale blue horizon. I sat on a rock and ate some trail mix, feeling a light breeze cool my face. When I got back to camp, I prepared dinner and settled in for the evening. The woods were growing dark again, the chorus of insects filling the air. I was tired but content. That night, something changed. I woke up suddenly, my heart pounding. The tent walls were dimly lit by the moon filtering through the trees, and I could hear a faint rustling outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind or some small animal, but the sound was too close and irregular. It wasn't like the usual night noises I had heard before. It was sharper, more deliberate. I lay still, trying to listen, my ears straining. The rustling moved around the tent perimeter, soft footsteps on dry leaves, something brushing against the fabric. My mind raced. I had read stories of bears or wild animals, but this felt different. Too careful, too quiet. I reached for my flashlight but stopped myself. I didn't want to give away my position if there was something or someone out there. My phone was in airplane mode, deep in my pack, so no way to call for help if needed. The noises continued for maybe 10 minutes, moving around the tent, stopping, then starting again. I couldn't tell if it was one animal or more. Eventually, the rustling faded, and I drifted back to a restless sleep. Morning came slowly. I stepped out of the tent and scanned the area. The ground was disturbed, and I noticed some broken branches near my campsite that hadn't been there the day before. There were faint footprints around, not the kind of paw prints I'd expect from animals. They were bigger, and the shape was unclear in the soft earth. My heart sank a little, but I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was hikers or hunters passing nearby. I wasn't too far from a trailhead after all. Still, something didn't sit right. The rest of the day, I stayed close to camp, keeping a fire going and double-checking my gear. I didn't want to be caught off guard again. The forest was quieter during the day, but that evening, I noticed the feeling of being watched creeping back in. That night, the noises returned, worse than before. This time, I heard footsteps on twigs snapping, slow and careful, circling the tent. Then something scraped against the side of my tent. Long, slow scratches, like someone trying to get my attention or maybe just to intimidate me. I gripped my flashlight and a small hunting knife I always carried. I sat up, eyes wide in the dark. The scratching stopped. Silence. Minutes later, I heard it again. A low, guttural breath, almost a whisper, just beyond the tent wall. I could feel the weight of eyes on me. I wanted to scream or run, but my body was frozen, trapped by fear. Eventually, the noises stopped. The night stretched long, each minute crawling by. I didn't sleep again. The next morning, I packed my things quickly, eager to leave. But then I saw it. The tent fabric was torn in several places, deep rips not just from branches or animals. The cuts were jagged, sharp, and some had dark stains that looked like dried blood. My heart raced. I checked my knife. It was dull but still sharp enough to defend myself if needed. As I looked around, I found more footprints. These were clearer now, boot prints, big and heavy. Someone had been here, someone who had no business being this deep in the woods without telling anyone. I felt exposed and vulnerable. I decided not to wait for help or try to stay any longer. I broke camp fast, throwing my things into the pack with shaking hands. The forest felt alive with eyes, every sound amplified. The birds had gone quiet. Even the creek sounded muffled. I followed my planned route back to the trailhead, but I kept looking over my shoulder. At one point, I heard footsteps behind me. I stopped and waited. Nothing. Then the footsteps started again, faster this time, breaking branches and crunching leaves. I broke into a run, heart pounding in my chest. I didn't look back. After what felt like an eternity, I burst out of the trees onto the dirt road where I had parked. I didn't stop running until I was in the car, doors locked, engine started. Driving away, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting someone to be following me. But the road was empty. The forest loomed behind me, silent and dark. I reported what happened to the park rangers later, showing them the torn tent and describing the footprints. They said it could have been hunters or illegal campers, people who sometimes use those woods for things they shouldn't. They warned me to be careful and not to camp alone so deep next time. Looking back, I realized how lucky I was to get out without anything worse happening. The fear I felt wasn't from some ghost or legend, it was real, from people who might have been dangerous. The isolation of the forest made it impossible to call for help or defend myself properly. That trip taught me a lot about respect for the wilderness, but also about caution and awareness. Being alone out there isn't just about nature, it's about understanding who else might be out there too, and how little protection you have when you're truly isolated. Since then, I always check in with someone before heading out. I avoid camping alone in unknown areas, and I carry extra safety gear. The forest is beautiful and peaceful, but it can also hide very real dangers that don't come from fairy tales. The night I decided to go camping alone was one of those impulsive choices I would later think over many times. It wasn't that I was new to camping. I'd done plenty of weekend trips with friends before, usually in well-populated spots with plenty of company around. But this time I wanted something different. Something raw, something isolated, and just a little bit challenging. I picked a spot deep in the national forest, about a 3-hour drive from my house. The area wasn't popular. There were no official campsites nearby, just wilderness, thick trees, and some old dirt roads that were mostly used by hunters or forest rangers. I liked the idea of being completely alone in the woods. I packed carefully, or so I thought. The basics: a tent, sleeping bag, extra clothes, water, food, a decent flashlight, a map, and a compass. I brought a small first aid kit and some fire starting gear. I left my phone behind intentionally. No signal out there, and I wanted to disconnect. I told my family I'd be back in 2 days, left a rough location pinned on my laptop, and set off early in the morning. The drive was smooth at first, and I enjoyed watching the trees get taller and the air get fresher the closer I got. When I reached the trailhead, I parked my car, checked my gear one last time, and started walking. The trail wasn't marked well. I had to stop often to check my compass and map. The forest was dense, with towering pines and thick underbrush, the kind of place that felt untouched. It was the kind of quiet where even a twig snapping nearby sounds loud. I found a spot to set up camp late in the afternoon, near a small stream. The ground was soft with pine needles, and the sound of running water was soothing. I pitched my tent, gathered wood for a fire, and started cooking my dinner on a small portable stove. I sat by the fire for a while after eating, watching the flames dance and listening to the night sounds around me. The chirping of insects, the occasional rustle in the bushes. I felt at peace. Then things started to shift. I noticed it first when I heard a strange sound coming from the trees, just beyond the firelight's reach. It was a kind of dragging noise, slow and deliberate, like something heavy being pulled through the underbrush. I looked toward the darkness but saw nothing. My heart beat a little faster, but I told myself it was probably an animal. Maybe a deer or a bear moving through the forest. Still, I felt uneasy. I double-checked my surroundings, making sure my knife and flashlight were close by. I sat quietly, trying to hear more, but the noise stopped as suddenly as it started. I thought maybe it was nothing. Night grew deeper and colder. I crawled into my tent, zipped it up tight, and lay on my sleeping bag, staring at the ceiling fabric. I wasn't sleepy yet. The forest outside was alive with noise, the wind, the sounds of small creatures moving, maybe the calls of owls. But there was something else, a silence that felt forced, like the forest was holding its breath. Around midnight, I heard the noise again. This time it was closer, unmistakably near the edge of the clearing. It was the same dragging, scraping sound. I froze. I wanted to grab my flashlight, but my hands felt frozen. After a minute, I forced myself to turn on the light and peek out the tent's small window. The beam cut through the darkness, shining on the trees about 20 feet away. For a moment, nothing moved. Then I saw it. A large shape crouched low, slowly moving behind the trees. It was too big for a deer, and it didn't look like any animal I knew. Its movements were awkward, almost human, but wrong. I snapped the light off and pulled the tent flap closed, my heart pounding so hard I was afraid it would burst. I tried to calm down, telling myself it could be a hunter or a ranger checking the area, maybe a lost hiker. But no one had been expected out here, and the last thing I wanted was to run into a stranger at night, in the middle of nowhere. The rest of the night was a nightmare. I kept hearing the noises, the dragging, the footsteps, the occasional snap of a branch. They seemed to circle the camp, getting closer then pulling away. I dared not leave the tent, couldn't sleep. I kept my knife ready and the flashlight in my hand, waiting for dawn. When morning finally broke, I stepped outside cautiously. The forest looked normal, the way it should, peaceful and quiet. But on the ground around my tent, I saw signs that terrified me. There were deep scratches in the dirt, dragged marks from something heavy, and broken branches at strange angles. Near the fire pit, there were footprints, big, uneven, and not quite human. I took pictures with my phone, hoping I could show someone later, but mostly I just wanted to prove to myself I hadn't imagined it. I packed up quickly and started hiking back toward the trailhead, constantly looking over my shoulder. The forest felt different in daylight, still thick and wild, but less threatening. Still, the feeling of being watched stayed with me. As I got closer to the car, I saw tire tracks in the dirt, fresh, wide, and messy. Someone had driven a big truck down the trail. I felt a sick knot form in my stomach. Whoever or whatever was out here wasn't far away. When I finally reached the car, I locked the doors and sat inside for a moment, trying to steady my breathing. I wanted to tell myself it was over, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. The forest kept its secrets, and that night had shown me a part of it I wasn't meant to see. Driving away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that shape lurking at the edge of the trees. It never appeared, but the fear didn't go away. The experience left me shaken. I told my family I had a great trip, kept the strange marks to myself, and deleted the pictures. The forest, I realized, holds more than just trees and animals. It holds the unknown, and sometimes it's best to leave it that way. I planned this trip for months. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway. Just me, my backpack, and the wild. I wanted to get away from the city noise, the deadlines, the endless rush of everyday life. I needed to feel something real again, something raw. So I picked a spot deep in the forest, far enough from roads and towns, a place I'd never been before. The drive out was long but peaceful. The city faded behind me like a bad dream, replaced by the slow, steady rhythm of trees and dirt roads. I pulled over near a narrow trailhead marked on the map, grabbed my pack, and started walking. The air was cool but dry, and the forest felt alive with the sounds of birds and insects. The ground was soft underfoot, covered in pine needles and fallen leaves. I walked for hours, deeper and deeper into the woods. My pack felt heavy with all the gear I brought: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, stove. I didn't want to miss anything. When the sun began to lower, I found a small clearing with enough flat ground to set up camp. The area was surrounded by tall pines and thick underbrush, and I liked that it felt hidden and private. No other hikers, no sounds of cars, just the forest. Setting up the tent took a while in the fading light. I was careful, making sure the tent was tight and stable. I collected some dry wood for a fire, then built a small ring of stones around it. The first fire spark was always the hardest. It took several tries, but finally the dry twigs caught flame, and I watched the small fire grow. Flames licked the air and crackled as they consumed the wood. I pulled out my small stove and started heating water for dinner. I ate a simple meal, dehydrated pasta mixed with some canned vegetables. It wasn't much, but it tasted like the best food in the world after a day on my feet. I sat near the fire and took in the sounds around me. Night was settling in fast, and the forest was changing. The daytime birds stopped singing, replaced by the chirps of crickets and the distant calls of owls. It was peaceful, too peaceful. That's when I noticed it. A faint sound, like footsteps on dry leaves, just beyond the edge of the clearing. I stopped moving and listened. The sounds were irregular, slow, and definitely not animal noises. I held my breath and waited. The firelight flickered, casting long shadows in every direction. I told myself it was probably a deer or some other animal moving through the forest. Still, the footsteps continued. They circled around the clearing, slow and careful, almost like someone was trying not to be noticed. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the sounds. Nothing, just trees and shadows. I put the flashlight down and tried to calm my racing heart. Maybe I was just imagining things. I was alone out here after all, and the mind plays tricks in the dark. I went to sleep that night with one eye open, listening for any unusual noise. The wind blew softly, carrying the scent of pine and earth, but the footsteps never returned. Morning came with soft golden light spilling through the trees. I felt better, almost silly for being scared. I packed up camp quickly, eager to explore more before heading back. I followed a narrow stream upstream, enjoying the cool water and the sunlight filtering through the leaves. It felt good to be alone, to breathe clean air and leave the world behind. But then, about an hour later, I noticed something strange. Scattered along the bank of the stream were small piles of rocks, not natural formations, but carefully stacked. I remembered reading about trail markers left by hikers to guide others, but these piles didn't seem to form any pattern. They were irregular, placed in strange spots off the path. I kept walking, but the piles kept appearing on fallen logs, beside bushes near tree roots. Something about them felt off. That's when I noticed fresh footprints in the mud, leading off the trail and deeper into the forest. They were human footprints, big and heavy, like a man's boots. The prints were fresh, no more than a few hours old. I followed the prints for a while, curiosity mixed with unease. The trail led away from the stream into thicker woods. The trees grew closer together, and the underbrush thickened. It was harder to walk here, and the sky was mostly blocked by leaves. The footprints stopped near a small hill. At the top, I spotted something else. A tarp, camouflaged with branches and leaves, stretched between two trees. It looked like someone's makeshift shelter. My heart started pounding harder. Someone else was out here close by. I scanned the area but saw no one. The tarp looked fresh, like it had been set up recently. I thought about turning back, but something made me want to keep going, to find out who was out here. Maybe a lost hiker or camper. Maybe someone who needed help. I circled the hill slowly, trying to see more of the shelter without being seen. Under the tarp, I could make out a small campfire pit, cold now but with some ashes still warm. There were some empty cans and plastic bottles, trash scattered nearby. No sign of people. I called out, but no answer. The forest swallowed my voice. I decided to leave, feeling more uncomfortable than before. The sun was lower now, and I wanted to get back to my own camp before dark. As I walked back down the hill, I noticed more piles of rocks scattered along the way, but this time they looked like warnings. Small towers built with sharp sticks sticking out, placed right in the middle of the trail. I slowed down, feeling like I was being watched. By the time I got back to my clearing, the sun was almost gone. I hurried to set up my tent again and build a fire. I kept my knife close, just in case. That night was worse than the first. The footsteps returned, this time closer, circling the camp. Sometimes, I thought I heard voices whispering far away, too soft to understand. My flashlight flickered once or twice, and my hands shook while I tried to fix the batteries. I kept telling myself it was probably some local hunter or hiker, maybe someone else camping nearby. But then, around midnight, I heard the worst sound, the snap of a branch very close to my tent. I froze, listening. The footsteps stopped. Silence. My heart raced. I held my breath, waiting for anything else. Then, a sudden crunch as something heavy moved away quickly through the leaves. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the darkness. I saw a dark figure moving fast between the trees, disappearing almost instantly. I packed up everything as fast as I could, ignoring the cold and the wet dew settling in. I didn't want to stay here one more second. The problem was, I had no clear path back to the car. The forest looked different in the dark, and my GPS signal was weak, barely working. I tried to keep calm and walk toward the trailhead. The sounds of the forest were now full of strange noises, branches breaking, twigs snapping, leaves rustling. I was not alone. I kept hearing footsteps behind me, but when I turned around, nothing was there. No eyes shining, no shadows moving, only the dark forest. For hours, I walked, following the faint light of my phone screen. Every time I stopped, the footsteps stopped. Every time I moved, they moved too. I felt trapped in a nightmare. At some point, exhaustion hit me hard. I stumbled and almost fell into a small ditch. My legs were cramping, and my throat was dry. I wanted to scream, but the forest swallowed my voice. Then I saw a light, a small beam far ahead. It was artificial, like a flashlight or a lantern. I ran toward it, hoping for rescue. But as I got closer, the light disappeared. Only darkness. I kept going, feeling more desperate. Eventually, just before dawn, I found a dirt road. It was the one I had come in on. I walked as fast as I could until I saw my car, parked exactly where I left it. I never looked back. The ending. I drove away from the forest without stopping. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tight they hurt. The sky was turning orange with the coming sunrise, but I felt like I was escaping something far worse than the dark. When I got home, I told myself it was just an unlucky encounter. Maybe someone crazy living in the woods watching hikers. Maybe a hunter or a trespasser who didn't want to be found. Whatever it wasn't ghosts or monsters, it was real, human. The piles of rocks, the footsteps, the hidden shelter. They were all signs of someone who lived there or was hiding from the world. Someone dangerous enough to make me pack up and run in the middle of the night. Since then, I haven't been back. I changed my camping habits. I stick to popular campsites now where there are other people. I don't hike alone anymore. The forest is beautiful and peaceful most of the time, but sometimes it hides things you don't want to see. Things that watch you in silence and follow your steps, waiting for the moment you slip up. I learned that lesson the hard way. Camping isn't always safe, and sometimes the scariest stories are the ones you don't hear, because those who lived them ran away and never looked back. I had been planning this trip for months. The idea was simple. Head deep into the wilderness, far enough from the noise of the city to feel completely alone, and camp out for 4 days. No distractions, no people, just me and the forest. I've been camping before many times, always in places with decent cell reception or at least a trail nearby where I could get help if something went wrong. But this time I wanted more. I wanted to test myself to see if I could really handle being cut off from everything, with only my own skills and instincts to rely on. I wanted to be alone, truly alone, in a place where I wouldn't stumble upon other campers or hikers. The spot I chose was tucked away in a national forest in the Pacific Northwest. Dense woods, thick underbrush, and miles from any official trails. I studied the topographic maps for hours and picked a location near a small creek, surrounded by tall fir and cedar trees. The place was remote enough that no one I knew had ever been there. I packed my gear carefully. A heavy-duty tent, a reliable sleeping bag rated for cold nights, a stove with fuel, enough dehydrated food for 4 days, water purification tablets, a first aid kit, a compass, a detailed map, a decent knife, a headlamp, batteries, and a small hand axe. I didn't bring a phone. Except for an emergency GPS beacon I planned to activate only if things really went south. I drove for hours until I reached a small dirt road that ended at a clearing by the forest's edge. From there, it was a 7-mile hike with all my gear to the spot I'd picked. I started early in the morning with the sun just coming up. The air was cold but fresh, and the forest was alive with birdsong and the soft rustling of leaves. The path I took was faint, mostly animal trails and old logging tracks, but it was enough to guide me. I crossed several small creeks, climbed over fallen trees, and pushed through thick patches of brush. The weight of my backpack was a constant reminder of the reality of this trip. No one was going to carry my load for me. By late afternoon, I finally reached the clearing I'd marked on my map. It was just as I had hoped. Secluded, quiet, and beautiful. The creek trickled nearby, clear and cold. I set up my tent on a flat patch of ground, making sure to clear away any sharp sticks or rocks. I arranged my gear carefully, stored my food in a bear-proof container, and took some time to rest and eat. The sun was dipping low by then, casting long shadows between the trees. Night came fast, I cooked a simple meal of rice and dried vegetables, boiled some water, and filtered it for drinking. The forest was darker than I had imagined, the thick canopy blocking almost all the moonlight. I lit my headlamp and sat just outside the tent, staring into the blackness beyond the reach of the light. The sounds of the forest changed as the day creatures settled down and the night ones woke up. Owls hooting, small animals scurrying through the underbrush, the occasional snap of a twig. At some point, I decided to go to bed. I zipped up my sleeping bag tightly and lay inside the tent. The quiet was both comforting and unsettling. I'm used to city noise, the hum of traffic, distant sirens, the chatter of people. Here, the silence felt like a weight pressing down on me. I told myself it was just the natural sounds of the forest, nothing to worry about. Around 2 a.m., I woke up. Something had woken me. I wasn't sure what exactly, but my body was tense and my mind was alert. The wind outside had picked up, rustling the tent's fabric and making the branches above scrape and creak. I lay there listening. Then I heard it. Something different from the usual forest noises. A crunching sound, like footsteps, but heavier, slow, careful. Not the sound of an animal, or at least not one I recognized. I froze, my heart pounding. I wasn't sure if I was hearing things or if someone or something was moving nearby. The thought of another person out here, so far from any trail or road, was unsettling. Why would someone be out here at night? My mind raced through possibilities. A lost hiker, a poacher, someone with bad intentions. I didn't dare unzip the tent or shine my headlamp outside. Instead, I stayed as quiet as possible, trying to listen closely. The footsteps continued, moving slowly around the edge of my clearing. They didn't sound like they were searching for anything, just walking in circles. Then, abruptly, the noise stopped. Dead silence again. The kind of silence that makes you realize how alone you really are. I didn't sleep much the rest of that night. Every time the wind shifted, every snap of a twig, I was wide awake, heart racing. When dawn finally broke, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The forest looked peaceful, as if nothing had disturbed it. I scanned the ground carefully and noticed something strange. Footprints, big ones, not like deer or elk, but definitely human. The prints were fresh, barely dried mud, circling the clearing in the same pattern I had heard at night. They stopped abruptly about 20 feet from my tent. For a moment, I debated whether to pack up and leave immediately. But I was committed to the trip and I told myself to stay calm. I inspected my gear to make sure nothing was disturbed. Everything was intact. The food container was still secure. Nothing missing. I spent the day exploring the area cautiously, keeping my knife ready. The forest was still beautiful, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I set up simple snares around the clearing for small animals, not because I needed food, but because it gave me a sense of control. I kept my fire small and always burning during the day, and I made sure to mark my tent clearly with brightly colored tape, thinking maybe the footsteps belonged to someone who was lost or passing through. That night, I was more prepared. I kept my flashlight and knife by my side inside the tent, and I put a small rock on top of the tent's zipper so I'd hear if someone tried to open it. Again, the footsteps came around midnight. This time, they seemed even closer. My heart was in my throat. I didn't move, didn't breathe too loudly. The footsteps circled once and then stopped near the creek. After a while, I heard something else. Soft voices, muffled and distant. No clear words, but definitely human. I didn't respond. I stayed silent, listening until the voices faded and the footsteps disappeared. When the morning came, I found more footprints. They were all around, but no signs of anyone approaching the tent itself. The next day, I debated what to do. I considered leaving, but the idea of walking 7 miles back through unknown terrain, possibly with whoever was nearby, scared me even more. So I stayed, but I made a plan. I set some small tripwires around the tent. Nothing dangerous, just to make noise if someone came close. I also started keeping my emergency GPS beacon in hand, ready to activate if I needed to. That afternoon, I noticed something else. Odd marks on the trees near the clearing. Deep scratches, as if someone had taken a knife or axe and carved long lines into the bark. Some of the marks looked fresh, raw, and bleeding sap. Others were older, faded. I couldn't tell what the pattern meant, if anything, but it added to the unease. That night, everything changed. Around 1 a.m., the footsteps came again, louder and more aggressive. This time, they didn't circle, they came straight toward the tent. I heard a scraping noise on the tent fabric. Someone was trying to get inside. My hand gripped the knife tightly. I whispered to myself to stay calm. I pressed the rock on the zipper. It made a small noise, but whoever was outside didn't stop. Then I heard a loud tear. Someone had ripped a hole in the tent side. My heart exploded with fear. I grabbed the flashlight and shone it through the hole. The beam caught a man's face, dirty, with wild eyes and a thick beard. He looked desperate and scared, but also dangerous. I stood frozen for a moment. He didn't say anything, just stared back at me. Then he lunged inside. I reacted instantly. I swung the knife toward him, aiming to stop him. There was a struggle, but I managed to shove him out. He stumbled back, cursing, and ran off into the forest. My hands shook. I zipped up the tent as best I could, patched the hole with duct tape from my kit, and kept the flashlight trained on the opening. The rest of the night passed with tense silence. The first light, I packed up everything quickly. I didn't want to stay another night with whoever that man was still out there. As I broke down the camp, I noticed more footprints, smaller, like the man had come with others, but no other people had shown themselves. I started the hike back immediately, moving as fast as I could without risking injury. The forest felt different now, more threatening. I kept my eyes peeled for any signs of the man or his companions. I found more tree carvings, this time in patterns that looked like crude maps or markings, as if someone was tracking or hunting. After several hours, I reached the dirt road and got into my car, locking the doors and starting the engine. The relief was overwhelming. I drove away without looking back. Later, I reported the incident to the local ranger station. They told me that this area had a history of illegal campers and transient people. I remember every second of that trip, even though I wish I could forget most of it. It started out as a simple solo camping weekend, something I had done plenty of times before. I was used to the solitude of the woods and the quiet that came with it. This time, I decided to camp somewhere new, a forested area that wasn't well known or popular. I wanted peace and a break from the usual trails that were crowded. What I found instead was something else entirely, something that shook me down to my core. I set out early Friday morning, driving until the road turned from paved to dirt. The forest grew thicker around me, tall pine and oak trees shading the path, their trunks wide and darkened with age. I parked my car at the edge of a small clearing. The map showed a narrow trail winding from there into the heart of the woods. I packed only what I needed: a sturdy tent, a sleeping bag, enough food for 2 days, water, a small camping stove, a first aid kit, and my trusty old flashlight. The trail was rough. Roots poked through the earth like jagged teeth, and patches of moss made the ground slippery. The forest floor was thick with fallen leaves and twigs that crunched beneath my boots. The air smelled fresh, like pine needles and damp earth. Birds chirped in the distance, and occasionally a squirrel darted through the branches overhead. I walked for nearly 2 hours before I found a good spot to set up camp. It was a small clearing, sheltered by tall trees, with soft soil perfect for my tent stakes. I cleared away some leaves and rocks, then pitched my tent carefully. I made a small fire pit with stones gathered from nearby and set up my stove to boil water for dinner. As the sun sank lower, the forest changed. Shadows grew longer and darker, the sounds of wildlife grew quieter, and the cool evening air settled in. I sat near the fire, eating a simple meal of canned beans warmed up with some bread. The crackling flames and the smell of burning would made me feel calm. I thought about the night ahead, how peaceful it would be, lying under the stars, far from the noise of civilization. After I finished eating, I cleaned up and packed away the stove. I lay back on my sleeping pad inside the tent and listened to the sounds outside. the rustling of leaves, distant bird calls, and the occasional snap of a twig. The wind picked up, blowing gently through the branches, and I felt myself begin to relax. But then something changed. It was subtle at first, a faint noise that didn't quite belong in the forest at night. A soft, irregular sound, like something dragging across the ground. I sat up and listened carefully. The noise stopped. Maybe it was just the wind or an animal moving far away. I told myself to calm down and went back to lying down. But the sound returned, louder and closer this time. It wasn't a normal animal noise. It was slower, heavier, like something big dragging itself along the forest floor. My heart started to race. I zipped open the tent flap and shined my flashlight outside. The beam cut through the darkness but revealed nothing. The fire pit was cold and empty. The trees stood silent. The sound had stopped again. I convinced myself it was probably a deer or some other forest creature moving nearby. Still, I felt uneasy. I checked my knife, making sure it was within reach. I kept the flashlight on and lay back down, eyes wide open. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. The forest returned to its quiet, but the tension stayed with me. Then I heard a new sound, faint, distant, but unmistakable. Footsteps. Not the light steps of an animal, but heavy, deliberate steps. They were coming closer, moving slowly around the edge of the clearing. I was frozen, heart pounding, breath shallow. I held my breath and watched the tent flap, half expecting someone to appear. The steps stopped for a moment. Then, I heard the crack of a broken branch nearby, followed by a low, dragging sound. I grabbed my flashlight again and yanked open the flap. The beam cut through the trees, searching for anything that didn't belong. The forest looked normal, only the shadows were deeper than before. But then I saw it. A shape moved just beyond the fire pit, large, hunched, and slow. It wasn't an animal I knew. It looked like a person, but twisted and strange. The figure dragged something behind it, a long piece of fabric or rope, or maybe a branch wrapped in something. I slammed the flap shut and zipped it up. My mind raced. Who was this? Why were they here in the middle of nowhere at night? I had no cell signal to call for help, and my car was far away. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I thought I heard something, I shone my flashlight outside. The figure never came into the clearing again, but I could hear slow, deliberate steps circling the edge. The dragging sound came and went, always outside, always close enough to keep me on edge. By dawn, I was exhausted but relieved. The figure had vanished with the first light. I quickly packed my things, eager to leave. As I walked back to my car, I tried to piece it together. It had to be someone living in the forest. Maybe a homeless person or a hunter. But why the dragging? Why the slow, heavy steps at night? When I reached my car, I called the local ranger station as soon as I got cell reception. I told them what I'd seen, the strange figure dragging something at night near the clearing. They said they'd send someone to check it out. Later that day, a ranger called me back. They'd found something near my campsite, a makeshift shelter hidden in the woods. It looked like someone had been living there for months, maybe years. They found old clothing, some food containers, and most disturbingly, several animal traps. The dragging sound, they said, was probably the person checking or moving the traps at night. The heavy steps were because they were carrying supplies or sometimes dragging caught animals. It was a survivalist living off the grid, but someone who wasn't trying to be friendly or seen. They were cautious, maybe scared, and definitely dangerous. I realized how lucky I was to get out when I did. Camping alone in the wilderness is always a risk, but running into someone who chooses to live hidden and isolated like that was something else entirely. I never went back to that forest, and whenever I camp now, I make sure to stick to well-known sites and stay aware of my surroundings. That night taught me that the scariest things out there aren't ghosts or monsters. It's real people, desperate and living on the edge, who might not want to be found. I decided to go camping alone that weekend. I had spent years hiking and camping with friends, but somehow this time I wanted to be by myself, to clear my head, to get away from the noise of everyday life. It was early fall and the weather was cooling down but not cold yet. Perfect for a few days in the woods. I picked a spot in a national forest I'd never been to before, somewhere remote but still reachable by a rough dirt road. The trail I planned to hike was marked on the map, about 5 miles into the forest, leading to a small clearing near a creek. I figured it would be quiet, isolated, and the perfect place to set up camp. I packed light but carefully. A tent, sleeping bag rated for mild cold, a portable stove, enough food for 3 days, water purification tablets, a map, a compass, and my phone with a fully charged power bank. I told one close friend where I was going and when I planned to be back, just in case. The drive out was long, bumping along the gravel road, surrounded by tall pines and maples beginning to turn red and yellow. When I reached the parking spot near the trailhead, I strapped on my backpack and started hiking. The first couple of miles were easy, the path well-trodden and dry. Birds sang overhead, and the smell of pine and earth filled the air. I passed a few small clearings and crossed a couple of wooden bridges over shallow streams. It was peaceful, the kind of peace that sinks into your bones. After about 2 hours, I came to a fork in the trail. I checked my map carefully and took the right-hand path, the one that should lead to the creek and the clearing I wanted to camp in. The trail grew narrower and the undergrowth thickened. The sunlight filtered through the canopy in dusty beams. I was making good time and feeling good, enjoying the solitude. Then, around 3 miles in, the trail started to get tricky. The dirt turned muddy in patches from a recent rain, and roots jutted out like gnarled fingers. I had to watch my step. A few times I slipped slightly but caught myself. The forest seemed quieter here. Fewer birds, less rustling of small animals. A feeling crept over me, subtle but real. I was alone, deep enough that no one would just wander through. That was part of what I wanted, but it also made me more alert. I paused at a large fallen tree that blocked part of the trail. I could climb over it, but after that, the path seemed to fade. It looked like the trail had eroded badly, or maybe animals had taken it over. I pulled out my map and compass and tried to orient myself. According to the map, the creek and clearing should be just beyond this point, maybe half a mile. I decided to push on, following the general direction I thought the clearing was in. The underbrush was dense, branches scratching my arms and face as I pushed through. My boots sank into wet leaves and moss. Every now and then, I caught the sound of water running somewhere nearby, but I couldn't tell exactly where. About an hour later, I stopped to rest on a mossy rock. I was sweaty, scratched up, and a little frustrated. I realized I must have lost the trail entirely. The forest around me was thick and tangled, no clear path anywhere. I thought about turning back, but the sun was starting to dip low in the sky, and the last thing I wanted was to spend the night stumbling blindly in the dark. I checked my phone, hoping for GPS. No signal. That wasn't surprising this far out, but still annoying. I had the compass, so I figured I could at least keep heading in the right direction, find the creek, and maybe camp there. I pressed on, pushing through ferns and tangled branches, feeling more and more exhausted. The forest seemed to close in on me. Tall trees all around, the sky a thin strip above. Every sound was amplified. The crunch of leaves, a distant bird call, the hum of insects. Sometimes I thought I saw movement in the corner of my eye, but when I looked, there was nothing but shadows. I kept moving until I heard the unmistakable sound of running water. A rushing creek, louder than before. Relief flooded me. I followed the sound, breaking through the last thick brush to find a narrow creek cutting through the woods. The water was clear but fast-moving, with small rapids tumbling over rocks. I sat on a nearby boulder, took off my backpack, and drank some water. I looked around for a spot to set up camp. The ground near the creek was damp and uneven, but a little ways back there was a small flat clearing, just big enough for my tent. As I started setting up the tent, the sun was almost gone, the sky turning orange and purple behind the trees. I got my stove out, boiled some water, and made a simple dinner, freeze-dried chili, salty but filling. The forest darkened quickly. I was alone, but at least I was safe. That's what I told myself. Once I was inside the tent, zipped up tight, I felt the first real chill of the night. The temperature dropped fast. I pulled my sleeping bag around me and lay still, listening to the sounds outside. The creek babbling, an owl hooting somewhere far off, the wind whispering through the trees. That's when I heard it. Faint cracking sound, like a branch snapping underfoot, not far away, somewhere in the darkness beyond the creek. I froze, heart pounding. I told myself it was probably a deer or a raccoon, something natural. But the snapping didn't stop. It was slow and deliberate, close enough that I could make out footsteps crunching on leaves. I stayed perfectly still, trying to hear more, but the sound stopped abruptly. I waited a long time, straining to listen, but the forest was silent again. Sleep was impossible. I lay awake, eyes wide, imagining what could be out there. The idea of another human, maybe someone with bad intentions, terrified me. But the woods were so big, and I was so small, hidden in my tent. Surely I was safe. At some point, exhaustion took over and I fell into a fitful sleep. I woke to cold and wetness. Rain. It was raining hard. Water was dripping onto the tent, making a steady patter that drowned out all other sounds. I pulled my sleeping bag tighter and tried to stay warm. The rain would last all night, I figured, but I was dry inside, and that was what mattered. Morning came slowly through the gray sky. I unzipped the tent and looked out. The clearing was soaked, puddles everywhere. The creek was swollen and rushing faster. The rain had washed away any footprints or signs from the night. I packed up slowly, hoping the rain would stop, but it didn't. The sky stayed heavy and gray. I tried to figure out how to get back to the trailhead. My compass was still working, but without a clear path, I could only guess. I started walking, following the creek downstream, hoping it would lead me somewhere familiar. The forest was dense, the ground slippery with mud and wet leaves. My boots squished with every step. After a couple of hours, I realized the creek was moving in the opposite direction I wanted. I must have been mistaken about its flow. I backtracked, trying to find another way. My clothes were soaked, my energy fading. My food was almost gone. I tried to stay calm, reminding myself to keep moving, to stay positive. Then I saw it, a flash of orange fabric caught on a branch. A trail marker or maybe someone's discarded jacket. Either way, it gave me hope. I followed a faint path marked by these orange ribbons, which led uphill through thick brush and trees. It was slow going, but I had something to aim for now. After an hour of hard climbing, I reached a ridge. From there, I could see a break in the trees far off. I moved toward it. Suddenly, the ground beneath me gave way. My foot slipped on loose soil, and I tumbled down a steep embankment, hitting rocks and branches. Pain exploded in my side and arm as I hit the ground hard. For a moment, I was dazed, lying in the dirt and leaves, trying to catch my breath. I checked myself carefully. No broken bones, but my side throbbed, and my arm was bruised. My backpack had caught some of the impact, but the strap was torn. I forced myself to get up. The fall had taken away some of my fear, replaced it with a sharp, raw focus. I couldn't stop now. I had to find my way back. I spotted the path again and limped toward it, each step slow and painful. The sun was dipping again, and I knew I couldn't stay out much longer. The trail eventually led me to an old logging road, overgrown but still visible. My heart lifted. I was close to civilization. I followed the road until I heard the distant sound of an engine. A truck, maybe. I shouted, waving my arms, hoping for help. After what felt like forever, a pickup truck appeared around a bend. The driver saw me and stopped. I told him where I was going, and he agreed to give me a ride back to the trailhead. Back at the parking lot, the first thing I did was call my friend. Relief washed over me as I spoke. I was safe. The ending, what happened that weekend, wasn't some ghost story or supernatural horror. It was simply the real danger of being alone in the wilderness, where a lost trail, bad weather, and a slip on the rocks could turn a simple camping trip into a fight for survival. I learned a lot from that experience. First, never underestimate the I had been planning this camping trip for months. It wasn't my first time camping, but it was my first solo trip deep into the wilderness. I wanted a challenge, something to test my skills and endurance. I wasn't a beginner by any means. I had done plenty of hikes and short overnight trips, but this one was different. The plan was simple. I'd hike about 12 miles into the Pine Ridge Forest, a place known for its dense trees, rough terrain, and few visitors. I wanted to be alone, to disconnect from everything, and just survive for a few days in the wild. I packed my gear carefully. I brought my trusted tent, a sleeping bag rated for cold weather, a portable stove, enough food and water for 5 days, a map, a compass, a first aid kit, and a sturdy fixed blade knife. I also had a bear spray and a whistle. I made sure everything was in good shape. I double-checked my backpack several times before leaving my car at the trailhead early one chilly morning in late September. The first day of hiking was tough but not brutal. The forest was thick with tall pine trees, their needles crunching softly under my boots. The air smelled fresh and damp, with a faint scent of earth and decaying leaves. Birds chirped overhead, and squirrels scurried up trunks. The sun filtered through the canopy in scattered golden beams. Felt peaceful. I stopped often to catch my breath and drink water, and I ate a quick lunch of trail mix and dried fruit on a large rock overlooking a small creek. I made good progress and found a good spot for my first campsite near a bend in the creek. I set up my tent, started a fire, and cooked a small meal of dehydrated pasta. The night was cold but not freezing, and the sounds of the forest at night, crickets, distant owls, were soothing. I fell asleep quickly, tired but satisfied. The second day was more challenging. The trail became rougher, steeper, and more overgrown. I had to cross a few fallen logs and navigate around thick patches of brambles. I realized the map I had wasn't very detailed, and the trails here weren't well marked. I kept track of my path by marking trees with small cuts on the bark with my knife, a trick I learned from an old survival book. I hiked for hours without seeing any other hikers or signs of civilization. The forest grew quieter. The birds disappeared, and only the occasional rustling of leaves or snapping of twigs broke the silence. I told myself this was normal. Wild places are like that, especially far from roads. Still, I felt a little uneasy, a faint tension I couldn't quite explain. Maybe it was just the loneliness. By late afternoon, I found a clearing with a small pond surrounded by ferns. It was the perfect place to camp. I pitched my tent and set up my stove again. While I was gathering firewood, I noticed something odd. Several large footprints in the soft mud by the pond. They were deep, about 12 inches long and 5 inches wide, with 5 distinct toes. I stared at them for a moment, heart rate picking up. They weren't human, too big and wide, and the shape was strange, like a huge animal had been there recently. I thought about the wildlife I had read about in the area, black bears, coyotes, maybe mountain lions, but none made prints exactly like this. I took a picture with my phone, then stepped back carefully. I checked my surroundings and saw no signs of the animal itself. Maybe it had passed through earlier. I made sure to keep my bear spray handy. That night, I slept uneasily. Every snap and crackle of branches outside the tent made me jump. I kept my knife on my sleeping pad within reach. I tried to stay calm, telling myself I was safe in the tent and nothing would come close. Still, sleep was broken and shallow. On the third day, I woke before dawn. The sky was gray and overcast, threatening rain. I packed up quickly and started hiking again. My goal was to reach the northern edge of the forest, where there was supposed to be a ranger station and a trail out. The forest seemed even more oppressive that morning. The trees were dense, their dark trunks standing like silent guards. The underbrush was thick, and the ground was uneven and muddy. I slipped a few times but kept going. My feet were sore and I was getting hungry. I ate a few energy bars and drank from my water bottle. Around midday, I came across an abandoned campsite. There were remnants of a fire pit, some crushed soda cans, and a torn tarp caught on a branch. I looked around carefully but saw no other signs of people. No footprints or trash beyond this small area. It felt strange, as if whoever had camped there left in a hurry. I examined the fire pit and noticed it hadn't been used for long. The ashes were dry and cold, I decided to rest here for a few minutes and eat. As I unpacked my food, I heard something faint, a low growl from the forest behind me. I froze, listening hard. The growl came again, a deep rumble, close but unseen. My heart pounded. I scanned the trees and bushes, but saw nothing move. I grabbed my bear spray, ready to defend myself if needed. The growling stopped abruptly, replaced by silence. I didn't wait around. I packed up fast and moved on, keeping my eyes and ears open. Every step felt heavier. The forest seemed darker now, the canopy blocking more light. I wondered what had made that growl. A bear? A mountain lion? Or something else? As afternoon wore on, the weather worsened. The clouds thickened, and a cold wind started blowing through the trees. Small drops of rain began to fall, turning to a steady drizzle. The trail became slippery and hard to follow. I used my compass and map, but the terrain was confusing. Suddenly, the trail disappeared altogether. I found myself surrounded by thick brambles and fallen trees. There was no clear path forward or back. I realized I was lost. I tried not to panic. I knew basic survival rules: stay put if lost, try to signal for help, conserve energy. But I was alone, no phone signal, no one to come looking for me immediately. I took a deep breath, pulled out my whistle, and blew 3 sharp blasts, hoping someone might hear. No response. I decided to find a safe place to camp for the night. I looked for a clearing nearby and found a spot sheltered by large pine trees and rocks. I set up my tent as quickly as I could in the rain. Inside, I lit my small camping stove and made some hot soup from my dehydrated food. The night was cold and wet. The rain beat against the tent's fabric like a drum. I wrapped myself tightly in my sleeping bag, trying to stay warm and dry. The growling from the day echoed in my mind. I lay awake for hours, listening to the forest sounds, the rain, the occasional snap of a branch, the hoot of an owl. Around midnight, I heard a new noise: footsteps. Heavy, deliberate steps moving through the wet leaves outside my tent. I froze, heart hammering. The steps circled my tent slowly, pausing, then moving again. I whispered a silent prayer that it wasn't a bear or any dangerous animal. The footsteps stopped right outside the tent's wall. I held my breath. Then suddenly a loud crash, something heavy falling onto the tent, shook the fabric. My tent poles bent slightly under the weight. I grabbed my knife and bear spray, ready to fight if needed. After a long minute, the noise stopped. The footsteps moved away slowly, fading into the darkness. I didn't sleep at all after that, waiting for dawn with every nerve on edge. When the sun finally rose, the rain had stopped, leaving the forest wet and glistening. I packed up carefully, checking the tent for damage. The bent poles worried me, but the tent still stood. I started walking again, hoping to find the trail or any sign of a road. After an hour, I spotted a faint tire track in the mud. It was old and partly washed out, but it gave me hope. I followed the tire tracks, which led me uphill toward a ridge. From the top, I could see a narrow dirt road snaking through the trees in the distance. Relief flooded me. I was close to safety. I moved faster now, despite my sore feet and exhaustion. But then, just before I reached the road, I saw fresh footprints around the edge of the ridge, large, similar to the ones I saw by the pond days ago. And scattered around were broken branches and crushed underbrush, signs that something big had passed through recently. I stopped and scanned the area. I noticed a few of the footprints led toward the road, and a few led back into the forest. As I started moving again, I saw something that made my blood run cold. About 50 feet ahead, in the middle of the dirt road, was a massive figure, hunched over, covered in thick dark fur, standing on 2 legs. It was huge, easily over 7 feet tall. My mind raced. This wasn't a bear or any known animal. But the figure didn't move, just stared at me with glowing eyes reflecting the morning sun. I froze, adrenaline rushing through me. After a tense moment, it turned and disappeared into the trees. I didn't stop to think. I ran down the hill toward the road, heart pounding, until I reached it and started walking fast in the direction of a nearby ranger station I had seen on the map. About an hour later, The trip started like any other. I planned it for weeks. I live near a city, but I have a small car and a decent backpacking kit. I'm not an expert, but I know my way around the woods. This time, I decided to try a new spot. A forest reserve a few hours drive away that promised solitude and a chance to get truly off the grid. No cell service, no marked trails, just me and the wild. I wanted to prove I could handle it alone. I left in the morning, loaded up with food, water, a tent, a sleeping bag, a small stove, and my trusty knife. The weather was clear, sunny, and warm. The drive was peaceful, and when I reached the entrance, I parked my car and began walking in with my pack. The forest felt alive and calm. The tall trees reached the sky. The ground was soft with moss and fallen leaves. Birds chirped here and there. I was smiling. This was what I wanted. I picked a spot about 2 miles in. I had a map and a compass and a GPS device just in case. The place was far from any trailhead. I found a small clearing surrounded by thick trees, perfect for pitching my tent. There was a small stream nearby for water. I set up camp carefully, making sure my fire pit was away from any dry brush. I wanted everything safe and neat. By late afternoon, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows between the trees. I gathered some dry wood and started a small fire. I cooked some dehydrated food, ate, and sat quietly watching the flames flicker. The woods were peaceful, but I was aware of the quiet changing as the day moved toward night. Birds stopped singing. Insects buzzed softly. The wind began to pick up, making the tree branches creak. I crawled into my tent around 9 p.m., zipped it up tight, and laid down to sleep. The night was darker than I expected, pitch black without the moon. I kept my flashlight and knife close. I felt safe enough. Around midnight, I woke up suddenly. Something felt wrong. The air was colder than before, and I could hear a faint rustling outside the tent. Not the usual sound of leaves in the wind, but something sharper, more deliberate. I stayed still, holding my breath, listening. The sound moved slowly around the tent, circling me like a slow, heavy breath. I could hear small twigs snapping softly, and then the dull thud of something heavy stepping on soft earth. My heart started pounding. I grabbed my flashlight, turned it on, and shone it outside the tent. The light caught nothing but trees and shadows. The rustling stopped. I felt the cold sweat run down my back. I told myself it was probably a deer or some animal passing by, but it felt different, like it was watching me. I tried to calm down, but I didn't sleep well the rest of the night. When morning came, I was relieved. The sun's rays filtered through the leaves, and the birds started their songs again. I packed up my stuff, drank some water, and started walking deeper into the forest, hoping to find a better place for my next camp. About an hour later, I found a nice spot near a larger stream. I set up camp again, took off my pack, and relaxed for a while. The air smelled fresh, the water made a soothing sound. I filled my bottle, took a long drink, and looked around. I felt safe, or at least safer than last night. But then I noticed something strange. On a rock near the stream, there were footprints. Big footprints. Not animal prints, they looked like boot prints, thick and deep in the mud. I don't know why, but I got a bad feeling. I hadn't seen any other people on the trail, and the nearest campsite was miles away. Why would someone be here in a place like this? I took a few pictures with my phone and decided to keep moving. I wasn't about to stay where someone else had clearly been. Maybe it was hunters or campers, but the thought that someone had been this close without me knowing it made me uneasy. Later that afternoon, while walking back to camp, I heard a branch snap behind me. I stopped dead. I spun around with my eyes wide, but I saw nothing. The forest looked normal, just trees and undergrowth. Still, my skin crawled. I began walking faster. Then, suddenly, I heard footsteps behind me. Not the soft steps of an animal, but heavy, steady steps. Slow but deliberate. I didn't run, but I kept my pace quick. I kept looking over my shoulder, but the trees blocked my view. The footsteps stayed consistent, always just behind me. Panic started to rise. My mind raced with every bad thought I'd ever had about being alone in the woods. Was it a person? Someone following me? Why? I didn't want to shout or make noise, fearing it might attract attention or anger whoever was there. I gripped my knife in my hand, ready for whatever. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped. Silence returned, but it felt heavier now, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I stopped walking and listened. After a few minutes, I cautiously turned around, shining my flashlight behind me. Nothing, no sign of anyone. I ran back to my camp, heart hammering, every nerve alert. When I got there, I locked my food in my bear canister and double-checked my tent setup. I ate quickly, trying not to think about what just happened. I told myself it was probably a hunter or someone else who got lost, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. That night, I stayed awake most of the time, flashlight in hand, scanning the woods around me. The shadows were long and thick, and every small noise made me jump. I felt eyes on me. I could hear twigs snapping again, faint but close. I held my knife tight, ready. Then, around 3 a.m., I heard something else, a low growl. Not like a dog or wolf, but deeper, more guttural. It was close, too close. I froze. The growling grew louder, mixed with the sound of heavy breathing. My mind screamed to get out of there, but I was trapped in my tent. The growling stopped, replaced by silence. I waited until dawn, too scared to move. When the sun finally rose, I peeked outside. No sign of anything. No footprints, no animals, nothing. Just the quiet forest waking up. The next day, I packed everything and started heading back to the car. I stayed on the trail this time, moving fast. But the whole walk back, I felt like something was watching me. Every so often, I caught glimpses of movement, a flash of shadow, a rustle in the bushes. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. By the time I reached the parking lot, I was exhausted and shaking. I loaded my gear into the car, locked the doors, and started the engine. Driving away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone or something following me. But the road was empty. Later, after I got home and reviewed the pictures I took, I noticed something chilling. In one photo near the stream, just barely visible behind some trees, was a figure. It wasn't clear, just a shadow, a dark shape, but it was definitely a person standing and watching. I hadn't seen them at the time. They must have been there the whole day. I reported the footprints and the figure to the forest rangers, but they said nothing suspicious had been reported. They told me it could have been hunters or someone trespassing. They advised me to stay safe and stick to popular trails. I don't know who or what was out there with me. Maybe a hunter, maybe someone with bad intentions. I'm lucky nothing worse happened. The experience left me shaken. It reminded me that the woods aren't just beautiful and peaceful. They can be dangerous, unpredictable, and sometimes downright scary. I don't camp alone anymore. I'm careful about where I go, and I always keep my guard up, because sometimes the scariest things aren't monsters or ghosts. They're real people and real fear. If you ever go camping, listen to your instincts. Stay aware. Trust your senses. And never forget that sometimes the forest isn't as empty as it looks. I've always loved camping. It was something I did alone, usually in places where cell service was weak or non-existent. I liked the silence, the escape from everything. No noise, no people, no distractions. Just me, the woods, and the basics. I'd planned a trip for a long weekend in early autumn, when the leaves start turning but the weather is still manageable. I found a spot deep in the woods of a state park, about 3 hours from the city. The place wasn't popular for camping, so it was usually quiet. I wanted that. I packed carefully, a tent, sleeping bag rated for cool weather, stove, enough food for 3 days, plenty of water, a map, compass, and a first aid kit. I wasn't an expert, but I was cautious and experienced enough to handle most situations. My backpack was heavy but manageable. The drive out was easy, the roads empty. I arrived at the trailhead just before noon, loaded my gear, and set off down the dirt path. The weather was clear, a little chilly in the shade but sunny in the open. The forest was quiet except for the usual sounds. Birds, wind rustling through leaves, the occasional crack of a twig beneath my boots. The trail was narrow but well marked with paint blazes on trees every so often. I hiked for about 2 hours, gradually climbing higher. The trees changed from tall pines to mixed hardwoods, the smell of damp earth and moss growing stronger. I stopped a few times to rest, drink water, eat snacks. The sun was warm on my face. I didn't see anyone else on the trail. Eventually, I found a clearing about the size of a football field surrounded by trees. The ground was flat and covered in dry leaves. I decided this would be my campsite. I unpacked, pitched my tent near the edge of the clearing where I could see the trail in and out, and gathered some firewood. The wood was dry enough to burn, but not so dry that it crumbled. I built a small fire pit with stones I found around. By late afternoon, I had a fire going and cooked some canned beans and rice on my small stove. The food was nothing special, but it was warm and filling. I sat close to the fire, watching the flames flicker as shadows lengthened in the forest. The air grew colder as the sun dropped behind the hills. I lay down in my tent early, listening to the forest sounds, crickets, an occasional owl hoot. I felt peaceful, tired but safe. Then something changed. Around midnight, I woke up to a strange noise outside my tent. It was subtle at first, a faint rustling, like leaves brushing against each other. It wasn't the usual animal noises I expected. It was deliberate, slow, cautious. I stayed still, holding my breath, trying to listen. The sound moved closer. Something was moving just beyond the edge of my small firelight, in the darkness past the clearing. The forest swallowed any shape or detail, but I could hear footsteps crunching dry leaves and small twigs snapping. My heart started to race, but I reminded myself that wild animals were common here. Maybe a raccoon, a deer, or even a coyote. None of those would want to bother a human, usually. I stayed silent, waiting for the noise to pass. But it didn't. The footsteps circled the clearing slowly, moving near the trees around my tent. Then the rustling stopped right outside my tent flap. I could hear breathing, heavy, uneven breathing. I stayed as quiet as I could, telling myself it was just an animal curious about the fire. But then I heard a low sound, not an animal growl, but a man's grunt, maybe, or something like that. It wasn't clear, but it was definitely not natural. I knew I had to be careful. I reached for my flashlight and my small folding knife under my sleeping bag, careful not to make noise. The rustling continued for maybe 5 minutes, circling the tent, before footsteps slowly moved away back into the woods. I didn't sleep again that night. I sat up in the tent, flashlight ready, ears straining for any new sound. The fire had died down to embers, but I fed it small twigs to keep some light and warmth. The woods were quiet again except for distant wildlife. Morning came slow and gray. I cautiously unzipped the tent to look around. The clearing looked untouched. No footprints near the tent except my own. Nothing obvious out of place. I packed up quickly, deciding to leave early. I took the trail back down, watching the woods carefully. The forest seemed peaceful, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The noise from last night wasn't natural. It had a human quality that scared me more than any wild animal ever could. About halfway back to the trailhead, I noticed something strange. A few broken branches and crushed leaves about 50 yards ahead. I stopped and looked closer. The branches were broken low, like someone had forced their way through the brush, not an animal. The footprints were there too, faint but fresh. Large boots, not mine. My heart hammered. I stayed alert, moving quickly but quietly. The trail was narrow, and I had limited options to hide or avoid anyone who might be following me. The closer I got to the trailhead, the more signs I saw. Broken twigs, disturbed leaves, footprints. It was clear someone had been nearby all night and was possibly following me. My mind raced through possibilities. Was it a hunter, someone camping nearby, a lost hiker, or something else? I didn't want to panic, but the thought of encountering a stranger in these woods at night made me uneasy. My phone had no signal, so I couldn't call for help. When I finally reached the trailhead and the parking lot, relief washed over me. A few cars were parked, but no people around. I loaded my pack into my car and locked the doors. As I started the engine, I noticed a fresh set of footprints in the dirt road nearby, heavy boots, heading the same direction as me. They were too large to be mine. I stared in the rearview mirror, eyes scanning the tree line, but saw nothing. I started driving immediately, not stopping for anything. The road was empty, and the drive back to civilization felt endless. Once I was back in town, I stopped at a gas station to call a friend and tell them what happened. The feeling of safety started to return. The next day, I went to the park ranger station to report what I'd experienced. They told me there had been a few reports recently about a man spotted near campsites who seemed to be following or watching campers. They were investigating but hadn't caught him yet. The ranger advised me to always camp in designated areas with others around, not alone, and to report any suspicious activity immediately. Looking back, I realized how vulnerable I had been. Out there alone, in the dark, with no way to call for help. The woods were beautiful but also unpredictable. That night had nothing to do with ghosts or legends. It was real people, real danger. The experience stayed with me long after. It changed how I thought about camping and wilderness safety. I still love the outdoors, but now I plan differently. Camp where others are nearby and trust my instincts more. That night wasn't just scary because of the noises or the darkness. It was scary because I knew someone was close enough to reach me, hidden just beyond the light, watching me with unknown intentions. And that, in the end, is what made me leave the woods and never take my safety for granted again. I had been working nonstop for 8 months straight. Long days, late nights, back-to-back shifts in the city, trying to make ends meet while keeping my sanity intact. When the burnout hit, it didn't come gradually. It hit like a brick wall. My boss noticed I was slipping, missing small details, zoning out, getting easily irritated, and he basically forced me to take 2 weeks off. I didn't argue. I just nodded, packed my bag that same night, and started planning where to go. A friend of mine once mentioned a secluded cabin in northern Idaho, not far from Priest Lake, surrounded by woods and a few miles away from any paved road. He had rented it a few years back and said it was peaceful and quiet, completely off the grid. No cell service, no internet, no neighbors. It sounded like exactly what I needed. I texted him, got the details, called the owner, and wired the payment. Within 3 days, I was on the road with my gear, some canned food, bottled water, a first aid kit, a few books, and my 9mm just in case. The drive up was long, over 12 hours, and by the time I turned onto the last dirt road that led up toward the cabin, the sky had turned dark, heavy clouds gathering over the treetops. I remember passing a rusty, bullet-ridden sign that said, "NO Winter Maintenance," which made me a little nervous, but it was mid-September and still dry. I figured I'd be fine. I finally pulled up to the cabin just after sunset. It looked exactly how I expected. Weathered wood, a tin roof, a little porch with a single rocking chair, and a heavy-looking door with iron hinges. There was a woodpile stacked against the far wall and a metal chimney poking out of the top. Inside, the place was basic but clean. A cot with some wool blankets, a small wood stove, a table with 2 chairs, and shelves stocked with candles, matches, and a few old pans. There was a shed out back, padlocked shut, and a small outhouse maybe 40 yards into the woods. I unpacked, cracked open a can of soup, and heated it over the little propane burner I'd brought. That first night was dead silent, the kind of silence that presses on your ears and makes every small creak sound exaggerated. But I slept surprisingly well. I didn't even wake once. The first few days went exactly how I hoped. I hiked during the day, read books in the afternoon, made simple meals, and spent hours just staring at the trees, listening to the wind move through the pines. I wrote in a small journal, mostly thoughts and random sketches. I hadn't felt that calm in years. Then, on the 4th morning, things started to shift. It began with something small. I was about 1.5 miles out, hiking along a ridge that curved down into a ravine. I had gone that way twice before, so I knew the trail. As I came around a bend, I noticed something odd. Broken branches along the path, fresh ones, as if someone or something had barreled through. First, I figured it was a deer, maybe even a moose, but the way the branches were broken low to the ground and several feet apart, it didn't quite fit. I looked for tracks but found nothing clear. Still, I brushed it off. Animals were everywhere. That's what I was out here to be around. Nature. But as I kept walking, I got the strange sensation that I wasn't alone. I kept glancing over my shoulder, not because I heard anything, but because the silence had changed. There were no birds, no squirrels rustling, just the sound of my own boots and breathing. I turned back early that day. That night, around 2 a.m., I woke up in a cold sweat. I couldn't explain why. No nightmare, no sound, just that prickling feeling you get when someone is standing too close behind you. I lay still for a while, eyes adjusting to the dark, heart racing. Then I heard it, a soft crunching sound outside. Leaves or branches, someone walking, slow, deliberate, not an animal. I knew the sound of deer or elk. This was 2 feet, human steps. I reached for my flashlight, clicked it on, and aimed it at the door. The sound stopped. I sat there for at least 20 minutes, barely breathing. I didn't dare move to the window. Eventually, I crawled back into the sleeping bag with the flashlight still in my hand and the pistol under my pillow. When I went out the next morning, there were no tracks. The ground was too dry, nothing to prove what I heard. I started to doubt myself. But that day, I didn't go hiking. I stayed close to the cabin, chopping some wood, organizing my supplies, checking the area. I didn't see anything out of place until I went behind the cabin near the woodpile. There, sitting on the ground near the wall, was a used cigarette butt. I don't smoke. I hadn't had a visitor. It was fresh, white filter. No signs of water damage or dirt on the paper. Someone had been here. I spent that night inside, windows covered, door locked, gun on the table beside me. I barely slept. The next day, I hiked up to the highest ridge near the cabin. It was a long 2-hour climb, but once I got to the top, I managed to get a weak signal on my phone, just enough to send a couple texts and drop a pin to my brother. I told him everything was fine, but asked him to check in every couple days just in case. I also snapped a few pictures around the cabin and trail, not really sure why, maybe for documentation. When I came back down the ridge, it was already late afternoon, and the sky had started to darken again. Rain, maybe. I picked up the pace, heart pounding for no reason. When I got back to the cabin, the first thing I noticed was the rocking chair. It had moved. Not just shifted, it was facing the other direction entirely. I had left it facing the trees. Now it was pointed toward the front door. I froze. I unlocked the door slowly, gun drawn, but the place was empty. Everything looked the same, except for one thing. On the table sat one of my books, open to the exact page I had stopped on. I hadn't left it that way. I always kept it closed with a rock on top to keep bugs out. I checked every corner, every cabinet, every drawer. Nothing was missing. Nothing else was touched. But someone had been inside. That night, I didn't light a fire. I sat in the corner of the cabin with my back to the wall, wrapped in a blanket, holding my gun, eyes on the door the whole time. Around 3 a.m., I heard the creaking again. Footsteps. They circled the cabin slowly, deliberately, crunching leaves, snapping a twig now and then, like they wanted me to know they were there. Then they stopped right outside the window next to me. I could hear them breathing. No flashlight, no talking, just breathing. Then nothing. By morning, I was mentally shot. I packed half my stuff, hiked back up to the ridge, and sent another message. I told my brother someone was in the woods, possibly stalking the cabin, and if he didn't hear from me every day, he should call the local sheriff. I was ready to leave, but the thought of walking down that road alone, unarmed, knowing someone was nearby, I couldn't do it yet. I decided to stay one more night, just one, and leave early at sunrise. I barely moved that day. I sat inside, gun loaded, every sound sending jolts through my body. Around sunset, I stepped outside just long enough to grab some water from the rain barrel. That's when I saw it. On the far tree line, maybe 100 yards out, stood a man. No movement, no face visible, just the outline of someone standing perfectly still, half hidden in the trees. Watching, I raised the gun. He didn't move. I backed into the cabin and locked the door. I didn't sleep. I sat in the dark with my gun pointed at the door until morning light finally broke. At dawn, I grabbed my bag, shoved everything I could carry into it, and made for the car. As I hiked down the dirt road, I kept looking over my shoulder. Every bird call made me flinch. The car was untouched. I drove straight out of there, didn't stop for gas until I hit a town with a working signal. I called my brother, told him everything. He wanted me to report it, but I didn't have a plate, a name, a photo. Just a cigarette, some footprints I never saw, and the terrifying feeling of being hunted. I never went back. Weeks later, I finally looked through the photos I had taken. Mostly trees, trails, hills, but one of them made my blood run cold. It was a picture of the cabin trail, taken from the ridge above on the day I climbed for signal. In the trees just off to the left was a faint human figure, partially hidden, barely visible, but it was there. A man, watching, camouflaged. I hadn't seen him when I took the photo, but he had been there the whole time. I don't remember what first drew me to the idea of staying alone in a remote cabin for a week. Maybe it was boredom, or maybe it was the kind of subtle exhaustion that builds up when everything in your life is just fine. Nothing's going wrong, nothing's going great. You start to crave something quiet, space, distance. It was early October, and I had saved up some vacation days that I wasn't using. Work was remote anyway. No kids, no partner, no pets, no real obligations. I had a friend who owned a piece of land in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, pretty far from anything, and a one-room cabin on it that he used mostly for hunting in the fall. It was old but livable, and I remembered him telling me years ago that if I ever wanted to get away, he'd be happy to let me use it. So I texted him, and 2 days later I had the key and the coordinates. He hadn't been out there since last season. Told me to bring everything I'd need. No running water, a wood stove for heat, no cell service, no roads for the last mile. I'd have to park by an old trailhead and hike in. The place wasn't on any map. It was about as off-grid as you could get. That was what I wanted. I left on a Tuesday morning, made the 6-hour drive north, and got to the trailhead around 4 p.m. The last hour of driving had been slow going, dirt roads, no signs, a few wrong turns. It was colder than I expected, mid-40s maybe, and the sky was gray and flat. A few orange leaves still clung to the trees, but most of them had already dropped, giving the woods that bare, skeletal look they have just before winter really hits. I parked, loaded my pack with food, water, clothes, and a few basic tools, then locked the car and started the hike in. It wasn't a bad trail, faint but visible, weaving between tall birches and pine. Took me about an hour to reach the clearing. The cabin stood near the edge of a small lake, weathered and dark, with a low porch and one visible window. I remember thinking it looked like it had just grown out of the woods, like it belonged there. It was quiet, not peaceful, just quiet. The kind of quiet that makes your ears feel like they're straining. No wind, no birds. I got the door open and stepped inside. The cabin was small, maybe 20 feet by 20 feet. One room plus a little closet-like space where there was a composting toilet. Wood plank floors, a cot against one wall, a small table and chair, a blackened old wood stove in the corner. Dust covered everything. Spider webs stretched across the corners. I swept them away with my jacket sleeve and got to work. I unpacked my bag, stacked some firewood that had been left beside the stove, and lit a fire. The first puff of smoke curled back into the room before the draft caught, and then the warm air started to spread. I heated up a can of soup on the stove, ate it standing by the window, then turned in for the night. I was tired from the drive and the hike. Felt good to lie down. That first night was when I heard it. I had just started to drift off when something thudded against the side of the cabin. It wasn't loud, but it wasn't subtle either. A dull, single thump. Not a branch falling, not an animal scampering, something with weight, something deliberate. I sat up in bed, heart racing, and listened. Nothing. I held still for what felt like an hour, straining to hear anything. The fire had burned down low, the shadows deepening in the corners of the cabin. I didn't have electricity, just a headlamp and a lantern. I flicked on the headlamp and scanned the inside of the room. Nothing moved. I figured it had to be a raccoon or a deer bumping into the wall. Still, it was hard to sleep after that. I must have finally dozed off because I woke up with sunlight leaking through the window and the fire cold. I told myself I was being paranoid. The woods were full of animals. I was just out of practice being this far off-grid. I made some coffee with my camping stove, stepped outside, and looked around. The ground was covered in damp leaves, soft enough that even a heavy animal wouldn't leave clear prints. I circled the cabin once. No tracks, nothing knocked over, no claw marks or broken branches, just forest and the still water of the lake. I spent that day chopping wood, fishing, didn't catch anything, and walking the perimeter of the lake. There wasn't another cabin or structure in sight. No tire tracks, no trails, no signs that anyone had been out here in months. The lake was perfectly still, too shallow for boats. There wasn't even the hum of distant airplanes or cars. Just wind, trees, and the occasional squirrel or bird. Still, that night I barricaded the door with a chair. Nothing happened. No thud, no movement. I slept a little better. The third day, I decided to explore deeper into the woods. I followed a ridge west of the cabin for about an hour until I came across what looked like an old deer blind nailed up between two trees. It had collapsed years ago, just a tangle of wood and rusted nails now. But near it, I found something strange. What looked like a fire ring, made from stones that had been blackened by old soot. There were bones inside, small ones, animal bones probably, but they'd been arranged in a neat circle, like a ring inside the ring. I stood there a long time, looking at them. They weren't fresh. They were clean, dry, almost brittle. No smell, no obvious cuts or breaks. Still, the shape they'd been laid in, it didn't look accidental. That night, the thud came again, but this time it was louder. 2 thuds, actually, on different walls, maybe 5 seconds apart. Thump, thump. I didn't move, just lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The fire was low again. I could hear the creak of the cabin settling, the distant rustle of branches, but nothing else. No footsteps, no voices, no animals chittering. Eventually, I slid out of bed and crept to the window. I crouched and peeked out, just enough to see the clearing. Empty, but I noticed something strange. One of the firewood logs I'd stacked outside was missing. I counted them every time I went in or out. There had been 6 left that afternoon. Now there were 5. In the morning, I found it about 20 feet from the cabin, sitting upright in the middle of the clearing. That was when I knew I wasn't alone. Could have been some kind of animal, maybe a bear, but why would it move a log like that? Place it upright? And besides, I didn't see a single track. The ground was soft. It had rained lightly the night before. Any decent-sized animal should have left something. I thought about leaving, but I told myself I was being ridiculous. I wasn't even halfway through my week. I hadn't seen anyone. No sign of a human presence. Just weird noises and a moved log. So I stayed. But I started sleeping with a hatchet by my bed. The next day, I didn't go far. Just collected more firewood, made some notes in my journal, and listened. Every time a branch snapped in the woods, I froze. Every time the wind gusted, I felt my heart race. That night, it rained hard. Thunder, wind, the whole thing. I could barely hear anything over the noise. The storm shook the trees so violently I thought one might fall on the cabin. At some point after midnight, I got up to pee. I lit my lantern and cracked the door. That's when I saw them. Footprints, not boot prints. Bare feet, human feet, dozens of them. They crisscrossed the clearing, overlapping, going in every direction. Some looked small, like a child's. Others were long, narrow. One set had a crooked toe, almost hooked inward. They were fresh, still wet from the rain, the mud glistening in the lantern light, and they led right up to the cabin door. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat in the corner with the hatchet in my lap, lantern burning low, ears straining. Nothing else happened. No knocks, no voices, just the storm. In the morning, the footprints were gone. The rain had turned the clearing into a soup of leaves and mud. Everything had smeared together. That day, I packed my bag. I wasn't going to wait to see what came next. I didn't feel safe anymore. I didn't even care if I looked paranoid. I just wanted out. I left around noon, after making sure the fire was out and the place was cleaned up. I hiked the trail back, moving fast, not stopping to rest. But when I got to where I'd left the car, my stomach dropped. It was gone. Not just gone. There was no sign it had ever been there. No tire marks. No prints. Nothing. Just wet leaves and the faint trail I'd come in on. I stood there a long time, rain soaking through my jacket. I walked up and down the road for nearly a mile in each direction, thinking maybe I'd made a wrong turn or parked at a different spot. Nothing. No road signs. No houses. No buildings. No car. I had a compass and a paper map in my bag. I sat down in the ditch and tried to reorient myself. If I followed the road west, it should eventually intersect a highway. It would be a long walk, maybe 10 or 15 miles, but I could make it before nightfall if I moved fast. So I walked, and the road never changed. No intersections. I'd always liked the idea of being alone. Not the lonely kind of alone, but the quiet kind. Just me and the trees, away from the constant hum of people, traffic, phones, and every little obligation that pulls at you every minute of the day. So when my cousin offered me his cabin in the mountains for a couple weeks while he was overseas, I said yes immediately. He told me it was quiet, remote, no cell service, and no neighbors for a good 2 miles. It sounded perfect. The drive was long, 7 hours from my apartment in the city, most of it winding mountain roads that got narrower the higher I climbed. I remember passing the last gas station, one of those old pumps with a mechanical counter and a bell that dings when you start filling. That was the last sign of life I saw before turning off onto the dirt road leading up to the cabin. The place wasn't fancy, just a 2-room wooden structure sitting on a slope, surrounded by dense pine forest on all sides. It had no foundation, just raised off the ground on cement blocks, maybe 3 feet high at the tallest point. The crawl space underneath was partially visible from the back. There was a rusted chain link fence half buried in the weeds and moss, and old tools hanging on hooks by the back wall, most of them crusted with age and spiderwebs. A small deck overlooked the trees. I could just barely see the faint shimmer of a creek through the thicket. Inside, it was rustic but comfortable. A wood stove, a kitchenette, a lumpy couch that looked like it belonged in a college dorm, and a bedroom with a sagging bed frame and a mattress that smelled faintly of mildew and pine. There was no internet, no TV, and no radio, just a stack of old books and a journal with half its pages filled with barely legible handwriting. My cousins, I guessed. The first few days were exactly what I'd hoped for. I slept in late, made coffee on the gas burner, and spent hours just walking the trails that led deeper into the woods. I'd brought a couple paperbacks, some canned food, and a solar charger for my flashlight and GPS. I took some photos of tree bark, mushrooms, animal tracks. I didn't see any bears, though I heard rustling now and then that made me pause and grip the knife I kept on my belt, just in case. At night, the silence settled like a heavy blanket. It wasn't peaceful silence, it was total. No hum from appliances, no distant cars, not even the wind sometimes. Just the faint creak of the trees outside and the occasional snap of something in the underbrush. The first night it unsettled me, but by the third I'd gotten used to it. I started sleeping better than I had in years, until the 5th night. That evening, I stayed up late reading a book by lantern light. I didn't notice anything strange until I turned off the light and got under the covers. That's when I heard it, a faint scraping sound beneath the floorboards. At first, I thought it might be an animal, raccoon, maybe a possum. The crawl space was open in places, and small creatures could easily get underneath. I tried to ignore it, but it kept going. Scratch, scratch, pause, scratch. It sounded deliberate, not the frantic scrambling of an animal, but slow, repetitive. I sat up and listened. After a few seconds, it stopped. I figured whatever it was had left. I went back to sleep. The next morning, I checked under the cabin. I took my flashlight and crouched down at the back where the space was highest. It was mostly dirt and rocks, with a few broken boards, rusted nails, and some trash, beer cans, cigarette butts, a plastic fork. It looked like someone had used the crawl space as a dumping spot a long time ago. I didn't see any fresh tracks, no animal droppings, no signs of anything living down there. I shrugged it off. Probably just my imagination. That night, the sound came back, but this time it was closer. Started just after midnight, right beneath the bedroom. I lay perfectly still, listening. The scratch was softer now, like fingernails against wood. Then there was a muffled thud, like something heavy shifting its weight. I stared at the ceiling, heart pounding, trying to convince myself it was nothing. After several minutes, it stopped again. I didn't sleep much that night. The next day, I inspected the crawl space again, this time more thoroughly. I found what looked like a spot where the dirt had been recently disturbed. It was subtle, but I could see where the leaves and pebbles had been brushed aside in a small clearing under the bedroom. I got down on my stomach and aimed the flashlight deeper into the darkness. I didn't see anything, just more dirt, a few broken boards, and a spider skittering away from the light. That evening, I blocked off the entrance with cinder blocks and some wire mesh I found behind the cabin. I figured if something was getting in, it wouldn't now. That night, I heard it again. This time it wasn't scratching, it was breathing. Not the wind, not the settling of wood. It was unmistakable. A slow, rhythmic inhale and exhale, like someone sleeping directly beneath me. I didn't move. I just lay there, listening to it for over an hour. It never changed pace, never spoke, never shifted. Just a deep, slow breath in the dark beneath the floor. By morning, it was gone. I went outside and checked the mesh I'd put up. It was still in place, untouched. No holes, no signs of digging. I even circled the cabin and looked for any kind of prints, but the pine needles and leaves made it hard to tell. There was nothing conclusive. I started keeping the hatchet beside my bed. The next few nights were quiet. No breathing, no scratching. I began to think maybe I'd been dreaming, or maybe there'd been a raccoon or a fox under there, and it had moved on. I almost started to relax again, until the 11th night. That evening, something changed. I felt it as soon as the sun went down. The air seemed stiller, heavier. I didn't read that night. I just sat on the couch, staring out the window into the darkness. I left the lantern off and listened. Around midnight, I heard a sound from the deck. It was the wood creaking just once, like someone had stepped on it, then stopped. I stood up slowly and picked up the hatchet. I moved to the window and tried to peer out, but it was pitch black beyond the glass. No moon, no stars, just trees and shadows. Another creak, closer to the door. I backed into the kitchen and waited, holding my breath. Then nothing. The next morning, I checked the deck. No tracks, but the mud at the bottom of the steps looked disturbed, like someone had walked up from the woods. I started considering going home early, but something held me back. Pride, maybe, or stupidity. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was probably an animal, maybe a bear. I didn't want to look like an idiot when I told people I left early because the floor made weird noises. That afternoon, I went for a long hike, tried to clear my head. I made it back around dusk. I found the front door ajar. I was sure I had locked it. I stood there for a long time before stepping inside. Everything looked normal. Nothing taken, nothing moved. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there, that they were still close. I stayed up all night with the hatchet in my lap. At dawn, I packed my bag. I'd had enough. I stuffed what I could into my backpack, double-checked the door, and started the long hike back down to where I'd parked the truck. I figured I'd be home by late evening. I reached the truck just after noon. That's when I saw the flat tire. Not just flat, slashed. 3 clean cuts right through the sidewall. My stomach turned. I checked the others. The front passenger tire had the same marks. I looked around the area. No footprints, no tools, nothing. That road was 10 miles from the nearest town, and I hadn't seen another soul in 2 weeks. Someone had done this, and they'd done it quietly. I had no cell service, no radio, no signal of any kind. I hiked back to the cabin. When I got there, the door was wide open. I approached slowly, cautiously, hatchet in hand. Inside, Everything looked the same, nothing obviously missing, but the rug in front of the couch had been flipped over. The books were scattered on the floor. One of the kitchen drawers was open. I didn't sleep that night. I pushed the dresser in front of the door and stayed in the corner with my back against the wall, watching the windows until sunrise. The next day, I hiked south, hoping to catch a signal. I carried only the essentials: GPS, knife, flashlight, water, a flare. I got a single bar of service at the peak of a ridge and called for a tow truck. It took 10 tries before it went through. The dispatcher said it would be at least a day before they could reach me, maybe 2. The roads were rough. I went back to the cabin and waited. That night was the worst. I heard footsteps on the roof. It started around 1 a.m., a slow, deliberate step above the bedroom. Then silence. Then another over the living room. Then silence again. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. Then came the breathing again, this time not under the floor. It was inside. Somewhere in the cabin, someone was breathing. I stayed frozen until dawn. When the first light came through the trees, I checked every inch of the cabin. The attic hatch was sealed. The crawl space was undisturbed. But I noticed something that hadn't been there before. I hadn't planned on staying in that cabin. The whole trip was supposed to be a quick weekend getaway. Just me and the woods. I wanted to escape the city's noise, the constant buzz of people and traffic, to clear my head. I figured I'd hike in, spend a night or two under the stars, then come back feeling better. I had done plenty of solo camping trips before, always in spots where I could pitch a tent or find a campsite. But this one ended up different. The plan was to hike into a remote part of the forest, in the northern part of my state. Dense pine trees, rough terrain, and a few old logging roads abandoned decades ago. I didn't have a clear destination. I just wanted to find a quiet place, maybe set up camp near a creek or a clearing. When I started walking, the air was cold, and the sky was a dull gray. The forecast had said it would rain by nightfall, so I packed accordingly, with rain gear and extra layers. I also had a small backpack with essentials: water, food, a first aid kit, my sleeping bag, and a small camping stove. After a few hours of walking along a rough trail, I came across a narrow dirt road that looked like it hadn't been used in a long time. The road twisted and turned deeper into the woods. I followed it, hoping it would lead to a clearing or a decent camping spot. Instead, after about 30 minutes, I saw the cabin. It was a small, old wooden structure, set back from the road by maybe 50 feet. The cabin looked like it had been there for decades. The wood weathered and cracked, covered in patches of moss and lichen. The roof sagged a little in the middle, and the windows were grimy but unbroken. The door was closed, with an old metal latch that didn't seem too sturdy but still held. At first, I was hesitant. I hadn't planned on staying in a cabin, especially one that looked so run down. But then I realized the rain was starting to pick up, steady and cold, the kind that chills you through your jacket no matter how many layers you wear. Setting up my tent in the mud and wet ground didn't sound appealing at all. I was tired too, and the idea of a dry roof sounded good. I decided to check the cabin out. Maybe it was abandoned, but at least I could stay inside for the night. I pushed the door gently. It creaked open, revealing a small room inside with a dirt floor covered by a thin layer of old straw. There was a wood stove in the corner, cold and rusted. A few old chairs and a table were scattered around, and some rusty tools hung on the walls. The place smelled musty, like old wood and damp earth. I didn't find any food or supplies, but there was a pile of chopped firewood stacked outside next to the porch. I didn't find any signs that someone had been there recently. No footprints in the mud, no cigarette butts or trash, but it was clear the cabin wasn't totally forgotten. Someone came here sometimes, maybe hunters or hikers like me. I decided to make the cabin my shelter for the night. I grabbed some firewood and got a fire going in the stove. It took a while to catch, but after a few minutes, the warmth started to spread. I took off my wet jacket, sat down on one of the chairs, and ate some canned beans I had brought along. The rain was steady outside, tapping on the roof like a slow drum. That's when I first heard the footsteps. They were soft, but distinct. Something was moving outside. I stood up quickly, my heart jumping. I stepped to the window and looked out into the rain, but the thick trees and darkness made it impossible to see clearly. The steps stopped. I held my breath. After a minute, I told myself it was probably just an animal or the wind knocking branches around. I tried to calm down and went back to the fire. But then the footsteps started again, this time slower, heavier, and they were coming closer, towards the cabin. I grabbed my small pocket knife, not because I expected to fight anyone, but because it was something to hold on to. I moved to the door and quietly opened it just a crack, peeking out. Nothing. The rain blurred the edges of the forest, the trees swaying with the wind, but no sign of anyone or anything. I closed the door and locked the latch as best as I could. I sat down by the fire again, telling myself I was just being paranoid, but the footsteps had unsettled me. I tried to focus on the flames, but I kept glancing out the window, watching for any movement. The rain slowed down after an hour or so, and I finally felt myself relax a bit. I lay down on the straw-covered floor, using my backpack as a pillow. The fire was dying down, but I still felt warm enough. I figured I would get some sleep, rest up, and be on my way early in the morning. I woke up hours later, not sure if it was the middle of the night or dawn. Something felt off. The air inside the cabin was colder than before, and the fire had completely died out. I got up and fumbled for my lighter, but it was empty. I hadn't brought extra fuel. I knew I had to get more firewood to start the stove again, or I'd freeze before sunrise. I put on my wet jacket and stepped outside. The forest was dark, with a thin fog hanging between the trees. I saw the pile of firewood near the porch, but something stopped me before I could reach it. The ground was covered with deep footprints, heavy, wide, and uneven. They looked fresh, like they had been made not long ago. They led away from the cabin into the woods. That's when I noticed something else. The dirt road I had walked in on was gone. Not physically gone, of course, but it looked like the forest had swallowed it. The trail was now covered with thick branches and fallen leaves, and the tracks I had followed to get here had disappeared completely. I stared down the trail, trying to find any sign of a path. The trees were too dense, the undergrowth thick. It didn't look like any normal trail anymore. It was as if the forest had closed itself off. I started to panic. I went back inside the cabin and grabbed my phone to check the signal. No service. No surprise. I had been expecting that. I checked the time. It was 3:42 a.m. I could hear something outside. Not footsteps this time, but a slow, heavy breathing. Low and deep. Sounded close. I froze. The breathing came from the side of the cabin, where the woods were thickest. I grabbed a flashlight from my pack and turned it on, sweeping the beam over the trees. I caught a glimpse of something, a dark shape moving just beyond the edge of the light. It vanished before I could see clearly. My heart was pounding. I shut the door quickly and locked it again. I sat back down near the window, knife in hand, and tried to calm down. I told myself it was probably a bear or a large animal, but the breathing continued, sometimes closer, sometimes further away. I didn't sleep again. When dawn finally came, I went outside carefully, shining my flashlight around. The footprints were still there, fresh and deep. They went all around the cabin, circling it, then leading off into the woods again. I knew I had to get out. I packed up quickly, grabbing everything I could. But when I tried to leave down the path I had come in on, I was stopped again by the forest. The trail was overgrown, almost impossible to walk through. I pushed forward, branches scratching my face and hands. But after 20 minutes, I realized I was going in circles. I was trapped. I decided to climb a tree to see if I could spot any sign of the road or the dirt path. I found a tall pine, climbed as high as I dared, and looked around. The forest stretched in every direction, thick and endless. There was no sign of roads, no clearings, just trees and more trees. I climbed down and sat on a fallen log, exhausted and scared. The heavy breathing started again. This time it was closer than ever. I stayed as still as I could, listening. After a long moment, I saw it. A large figure, covered in dark fur, standing just on the edge of the trees, looking at me. It wasn't a bear. It was something else. Taller, heavier, with long arms. I felt my throat tighten, my body freeze. I remembered everything I knew about animals in the forest. No creature this big should be out here, especially in the day. The figure didn't move. It watched me. After a few minutes, it turned and disappeared back into the forest. I ran back to the cabin, locked the door, and sat down trembling. I realized then that I wasn't just lost. I was being hunted. For the rest of that day, I stayed inside, too scared to move. At night, the breathing came back, closer and louder. I tried to stay calm. I tried to think. I remembered the pile of firewood outside the cabin. If I could start a fire, maybe the smoke would keep whatever it was away. But my lighter was dead, and I had no matches. I searched the cabin again, and in a dusty corner under the table, I found an old box of waterproof matches. They were damp, but maybe usable. I tried one. It sparked and caught. I got a fire going in the stove again. The smoke filled the cabin, and I felt a little safer. That night, the breathing didn't come near the cabin. In the morning, I planned my escape again. I waited until the sky was clear and the sun was high. I packed everything and decided to follow the footprints. They were the only signs of something real in this place. I took a deep breath and stepped into the forest. It had been a long time since I'd taken a break from the noise of the city. Work had been relentless, the stress mounting every day until it felt like my head would burst. I needed to get away. Just me, a cabin in the woods, and nothing but silence. No phones, no internet, no people. Just nature and myself. I found a small, isolated cabin deep in the forest, far from the nearest town. The pictures online made it look perfect. A sturdy wooden cabin with a fireplace. A small porch surrounded by tall trees that blocked out the world. It was exactly what I needed. I packed my gear carefully: warm clothes, food supplies, water, a first aid kit, a flashlight, and plenty of firewood. I was prepared. At least I thought I was. The drive was long, winding through narrow roads that grew rougher the closer I got. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, I could feel the weight of the quiet settling on me like a thick blanket. No cars, no people, just the sound of wind brushing through the trees and distant bird calls. I took a deep breath and stepped out, the smell of pine filling my lungs. The cabin was smaller than I expected. It had one room with a small kitchen area, a bed in the corner, and a wood stove. A thin layer of dust covered everything, showing it hadn't been used in months. I didn't care. I was here to be alone, to disconnect. I unloaded my stuff and started a fire in the stove, letting the warmth spread through the room. Outside, the sun was starting to set, and the sky turned a soft orange behind the thick forest. I spent the first night enjoying the silence, reading by the firelight, feeling the calm wash over me. It was exactly what I needed. The woods outside seemed peaceful, even beautiful. The stars shone brightly through the gaps in the trees, and the occasional hoot of an owl was the only sound breaking the stillness. I went to bed early, exhausted but content. The next day, I explored the area around the cabin. The forest was dense but not too wild. I followed a narrow trail that curved around a small creek. The water was clear and cold, running over smooth stones. I collected some fresh water, filling my bottle carefully. The woods were quiet except for the rustle of leaves underfoot and the distant calls of birds. Felt safe, almost too safe. I noticed a few old animal tracks in the mud near the creek. Probably deer or raccoons, but nothing to worry about. Back at the cabin, I cleaned up a bit and prepared a simple meal. I had canned beans, bread, and some dried fruit. The food was bland but filling. The fire was my constant companion, crackling and popping as I sat nearby. I read more and tried to write down my thoughts, something I hadn't done in years. I could feel the weight of city life slipping away, replaced by a slow calm. That night, though, something changed. I was lying in bed when I heard it, a faint, scratching noise coming from outside. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a bird scratching against the cabin walls. But the sound was too persistent, too deliberate. It didn't move around. It stayed in one spot, scratching rhythmically. I sat up, eyes straining in the dark. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, barely lighting the room. I grabbed my flashlight from the bedside table and aimed it out the small window facing the front porch. The beam cut through the darkness, but I couldn't see anything moving. The scratching stopped. I waited, heart pounding, listening for any other sounds. Nothing. I told myself it was just a squirrel or some small animal. The forest was full of them. I lay back down, but sleep was difficult. My mind kept running through every possible explanation, each one making me a little more uneasy. Morning finally came, and I felt better in the daylight. I convinced myself it was nothing, just my imagination running wild in the quiet. I decided to explore further, wanting to distract myself. I packed a small bag and set off on a longer trail I'd seen on the cabin's old map. The trail took me deeper into the forest, past thick clusters of trees and over fallen logs. The ground was soft and damp, covered in pine needles. I noticed more animal tracks, and at one point, fresh bear prints in the mud. I froze for a moment, heart quickening, but the tracks didn't look fresh enough to worry about an immediate encounter. I kept going until I reached a small clearing with a shallow pond. The sunlight filtered through the trees, sparkling on the water's surface. It was peaceful, and I sat down on a fallen tree trunk to rest. That's when I noticed the broken branches around the edges of the clearing. It looked like something large had pushed through the trees recently. I scanned the area carefully. There were no animals in sight, but the damage was clear. My unease from the previous night started to creep back. I didn't see anything threatening, so I tried to relax and took some photos with my phone. I wasn't expecting signal, but it had a tiny bit of coverage. I sent a quick text to a friend back home, just to say I was okay. No answer, but that was normal out here. On the way back, I stayed alert, keeping an eye on the trail and the woods around me. The forest felt different than before, heavier somehow, more oppressive. The peaceful quiet from the first day was gone, replaced by a subtle tension. When I got back to the cabin, I noticed something odd on the porch. A small pile of dirt and leaves was scattered near the steps, and the wood floor looked scratched in one spot. It was subtle but definitely new. I checked all the windows and doors. Everything was locked and secure. I hadn't heard anyone approaching, and the road to the cabin was far and rough. It didn't make sense. I brushed it off, thinking maybe a wild animal had been curious. I locked the door again and sat by the fire to calm down. That night, the scratching came back, louder this time. It wasn't on the porch, but from the back of the cabin. I stayed perfectly still, listening. The sound was deliberate and slow, like claws scraping against wood or stone. I grabbed my flashlight again and aimed it toward the back window. Suddenly, something moved just beyond the edge of the light. I caught a glimpse of dark fur and something large. My heart slammed against my chest. It was too big to be a raccoon or a dog. A bear? Possibly. But bears usually avoid humans if they can. This felt different. I stayed inside, holding the flashlight like a weapon. The noise continued for a long time. Scratching, sniffing, rustling. Then it stopped. No footsteps, no growls, just silence. I didn't sleep much that night. The forest, which had seemed like a refuge, now felt like a trap. The next morning, I decided to check the back of the cabin. I moved cautiously, flashlight in hand. The ground was disturbed, with deep claw marks gouged into the wood of the cabin's foundation. Scratches and dents marked the lower walls, as if something had tried to get inside. I found torn fabric caught on a nail near the base of the porch stairs. Maybe from my jacket or backpack, but I couldn't remember leaving anything outside. I felt exposed and vulnerable. I wanted to leave, but the nearest town was hours away, and my car was stuck at the end of the dirt road. Plus, I didn't have enough gas to make a long trip today. As the day went on, I tried to keep busy. I gathered more firewood, cleaned the cabin, and prepared a larger meal. Still, the tension never left me. Every noise outside, every shadow made my heart race. Late afternoon brought a heavy storm. Dark clouds rolled in quickly, and rain began pounding on the roof. Thunder rumbled, and the wind rattled the windows. It was loud enough to drown out the sounds outside, but I stayed on edge, worried about what might be waiting in the forest once the storm passed. During the storm, the cabin felt like a fragile shell against the wild. I checked my supplies: food, water, firewood, all enough to last a few more days if needed. I kept the fire going to stay warm and dry. When the storm finally passed late at night, the forest was soaked and silent. The moon peeked through the clouds, casting pale light on the wet trees. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to steady my breathing. Then I heard it again, footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving around the perimeter of the cabin. I froze, heart hammering. The steps stopped just outside the door. I held my breath. A faint scratching noise followed. At the bottom of the door, someone or something was trying to get in. I grabbed my heaviest flashlight and crept to the door. My hands trembled as I peered through the peephole. Outside, in the silver moonlight, I could see a figure crouching near the porch steps. It was dark, motionless, but unmistakably human. Panic surged through me. I realized I was not alone out here. Someone had followed me or found this place. My mind raced. Was this a robber? A stalker? Someone dangerous? I had no way to call for help. I slammed the door shut and locked it tightly. I grabbed the largest knife I had in the kitchen. Not much, but better than nothing, and backed away into the corner of the cabin, ready to defend myself. The figure stayed outside for what felt like hours. It was late October when I decided to take a break from the city and head into the woods for a few days. I had found a small cabin listed on a rental site, not far from a state forest I'd always wanted to explore. The pictures showed a modest, weathered wooden cabin, sitting quietly among tall pines. No cell service, no internet, just pure isolation. I was craving that. I wanted to be alone, away from the noise, the endless screen time, the pressure of work. I packed what I thought I'd need: warm clothes, canned food, a few bottles of water, a small first aid kit, a flashlight, matches, and some batteries. I brought my old camping knife, a sturdy folding saw, and a small axe that looked ancient but was surprisingly sharp. I left the city early in the morning, driving along winding roads that gradually narrowed and became dirt as I neared the cabin. The sun was low in the sky, casting a golden light on the red and yellow leaves falling around me. The air smelled clean and sharp. When I finally arrived, the cabin looked exactly like in the pictures. Small and weathered, with peeling paint and a sagging porch. The door had an old iron latch and the windows were dusty. I stepped inside and felt a rush of cool, stale air. The place smelled like old wood and damp earth. There was a small living area with a rough wooden table, 2 chairs, a fireplace with some old logs inside, and a mattress on the floor covered with a thin, faded blanket. The kitchen was tiny, with a rusted sink, a small counter, and an ancient gas stove. There was no fridge, but a small wood box in the corner where I assumed I could keep food cool. I set down my bags and opened the windows to let fresh air in. Outside, the forest was quiet except for the distant call of birds and the rustling of leaves. The sun was setting, painting the sky with streaks of pink and orange. I gathered some dry wood from the porch and lit a fire in the fireplace, watching the flames crackle and throw dancing shadows across the walls. I cooked a simple meal of canned beans warmed over the fire, ate slowly, and then settled down with a book. Night came quickly. Without streetlights or city noise, the darkness outside was absolute. I kept the fire burning low and the flashlight close by. At first, the quiet was peaceful, but as the hours passed, I began to notice other sounds. The snapping of twigs just beyond the porch, the faint scuffle of leaves, the distant howl of a coyote. It wasn't frightening, exactly, but it reminded me how alone I was. I tried to sleep, but the mattress was thin and hard, and the cold crept in through the gaps in the walls. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps outside the cabin. I sat up fast, shining the flashlight at the window, but saw nothing but swaying branches and empty darkness. I told myself it was an animal, probably a deer or a raccoon, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The next day, I decided to explore the nearby woods. I packed a small day bag with water, snacks, my knife, and the axe just in case. The forest was dense, with a thick carpet of dead leaves muffling my footsteps. The trees towered above, their branches bare except for a few stubborn brown leaves. I walked for hours, following animal trails, climbing over fallen logs, and crossing shallow streams. The silence was broken only by birds and the occasional rustle of unseen creatures. At one point, I noticed some fresh tracks in the mud, large, heavy footprints that looked like boots, not animal paws. I followed them for a while, curious. They led deeper into the forest, toward a small clearing I hadn't seen on the map. When I reached it, I found a makeshift campsite, recently abandoned. There was a small fire pit with cold ashes, a few empty cans, and a tattered sleeping bag. The area was scattered with scraps of food packaging and some empty bottles. It felt strange, as though someone else had been here recently and left in a hurry. I looked around for any sign of who they might be, but saw nothing else. I pocketed a small piece of broken glass I found near the fire pit, thinking it might come in handy. Then I headed back to the cabin, feeling a little uneasy but not alarmed. That night, the noises outside the cabin were louder. Branches snapped closer to the windows, and I heard heavy breathing outside. I sat by the fire with my knife on my lap, listening. After a while, the sound stopped, but the feeling of being watched stayed with me. I stayed awake until dawn, my senses on edge. The following morning, I decided to clear a path around the cabin. I grabbed the axe and started cutting away some low branches and dead brush, trying to make the area more open so I could see any approaching animals or people. As I worked, I kept glancing at the woods, half expecting to see someone watching from the trees. After a few hours, I noticed a new set of footprints leading to the cabin from the woods. They were fresh, muddy, and definitely made by boots. Whoever had been in the clearing the day before had come closer. I checked the windows and found one of them had been scratched from the outside, deep marks in the wood that looked recent. My stomach tightened. I sat down on the porch trying to stay calm. It was clear someone had been near the cabin, watching. Maybe they lived nearby or used the forest to camp. I thought about leaving, but my car was several miles back on the dirt road, and I wasn't sure how long it would take to get out. Plus, I hadn't brought much with me, and I needed to pack carefully if I wanted to leave. That night, I set several traps around the cabin using wire and sticks, mostly just noise traps to alert me if someone tried to come close. I also made sure to lock the door latch tightly and placed heavy furniture against it. I kept my axe within reach and the flashlight charged. The night was tense. At one point, I heard heavy footsteps circling the cabin, slow and deliberate. I held my breath, clutching the axe. The sound stopped suddenly, then started again on the other side of the building. For nearly an hour, the footsteps moved in a circle, never stopping, never breaking into a run or a sudden dash. At dawn, the footsteps stopped. I waited another hour, then cautiously stepped outside. Around the cabin, I found footprints all over the ground, too many to count, going every which way. Some of them led to the woods, others headed toward the dirt road. I decided then I couldn't stay. I packed quickly, grabbing what I could carry. I made sure the fire was out and the cabin looked undisturbed. As I stepped onto the road, I took one last look back at the cabin, feeling exposed and vulnerable. The walk back to the car took longer than I expected. The forest seemed thicker, darker, and the silence heavier. Every crack and rustle made me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following. When I finally reached my car, I locked the doors and started the engine immediately. I kept the doors locked as I drove away, watching the trees slip past in the early morning light. A few days later, back in the city with cell service and people around, I checked the news and local reports. There had been several reports of a man living rough in the forest near the cabin, someone who had been stealing supplies from hikers and occasionally attacking them. The police were searching but hadn't found him yet. Looking back, I realized how close I had come to something dangerous. It wasn't ghosts or myths, just a real person, hiding in the woods, watching, waiting. The cabin wasn't a peaceful retreat. It was a trap. I learned a few things from that trip. The woods are beautiful but unpredictable. Isolation can make you vulnerable. And sometimes, the scariest things aren't creatures of legend, but other people real, dangerous, and very close. I was working from home too much, staring at screens for hours and barely going outside. I wasn't depressed, exactly, but something felt off. Like I was slowly disconnecting from real life and I didn't even notice it until it got too loud in my head. So I figured, why not go off-grid for a bit? Just a week. No emails, no phone, no people. I found a listing online for a remote cabin in a place called Dry Pine Hollow, about 4 hours from where I lived. It had no cell service, no internet, and no neighbors for at least a mile in every direction. That was the appeal. I booked it. The owner, an older guy named Richard, gave me a list of instructions in an email. How to get there, since GPS would cut out, how to work the old propane stove, how to use the water pump, how to lock the windows, which I thought was weird to point out, and where to find the keys. He even sent photos of the place. A small A-frame cabin tucked between tall, dry pines, with 1 bedroom, a kitchen, a tiny bathroom, and a wraparound deck that overlooked a sloped hill that dropped off into thick woods. It looked peaceful, quiet. I left early on a Monday morning, packed with more supplies than I needed. Cans of food, pasta, jerky, bottles of water, batteries, a crank radio, first aid stuff, flashlights, extra clothes, a folding knife, and even a flare gun just in case. I wasn't expecting trouble. I just liked being prepared. The drive took most of the day. The road turned from pavement to gravel, then gravel to dirt. After the final landmark, a rusted-out blue mailbox with no house near it, I turned onto a single-lane trail barely wide enough for my car. Pine branches scratched at the sides as I crept deeper into the woods. Eventually, I saw the cabin through the trees. It looked exactly like the pictures. Old but sturdy, with a dark green roof and a thick wooden door that looked like it belonged on a castle. The air smelled like pine needles and dry soil. I could hear wind in the trees and nothing else. No birds, no bugs, just wind. I found the key in the spot Richard mentioned, a tin box under a loose floorboard on the porch. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and immediately felt the temperature drop. The inside was shaded and musty but clean, rustic. The floorboards creaked under my boots. The bedroom was small, just a cot and a nightstand. The kitchen had a small sink, a gas stove, and shelves lined with old canned goods. The bathroom had a metal shower stall and a composting toilet. Everything smelled faintly of mildew and sawdust. I unpacked, set my things down, and made a small dinner, beans and rice on the stove. The propane worked fine, though the flame was touchy. I opened the windows to air the place out. As I stood on the deck eating, I stared out into the woods and let the silence settle in. That was what I came for. Silence. It didn't take long for things to start feeling off. The first night was uneventful. I read a book by lantern light, listened to the wind through the pines, and slept like a rock. But by the second night, I started noticing small things that didn't sit right. Nothing big, not at first, like how the back door, the one that led out to a small slope behind the cabin, was unlatched in the morning when I was sure I had locked it. I figured maybe I had just missed it, but it stuck with me. Then, the next day, I found fresh scuff marks in the dirt just outside that same door. Not boot prints, but drag marks, like something heavy had been moved or pulled. I stood staring at them for a long time. I walked the edge of the tree line and saw more of them, irregular and shallow, disappearing into the underbrush. I told myself it could have been an animal, a bear maybe, but there were no claw prints, just long, messy trails like something had been dragged or shuffled. I stopped leaving the doors open after that. By the third night, I started hearing things. It began around midnight. I was lying in bed, still half awake, when I heard a dull thump, not outside, from inside the cabin, came from the living room area. I sat up, heart jumping, and listened. Another thump, then nothing. I grabbed my flashlight, clicked it on, and stepped out of the bedroom. Everything looked the same. I checked the doors. Both were locked. The windows too. I scanned the floor, the walls, the corners. Nothing. No animal. No person. Just an empty room that felt somehow less empty. I stayed up for another hour, then went back to bed. I didn't sleep much. The next morning, I noticed the lantern on the table had moved. Only a few inches, but it wasn't where I'd left it. I always placed it on the right side of the table. It was on the left now. I stood over it for a long time, thinking, wondering. I kept trying to come up with normal reasons for everything. Maybe I bumped the table and didn't notice. Maybe the propane stove made the thumping sound as it cooled. Maybe raccoons made the drag marks. Maybe I was just freaking myself out. But deep down, I didn't believe any of that. I didn't like how still the forest was during the day, how it went completely silent in the evenings, like the whole area was holding its breath. I didn't like how cold the inside of the cabin stayed, even when the sun was hot outside. And I didn't like that every night something small happened, something just weird enough to make me doubt myself. The fourth night, I was sure someone was outside. I had just shut off the lantern and crawled into bed when I heard it. Leaves crunching, slow, uneven footsteps. Not a deer, not a raccoon. It sounded like a person trying not to be heard. I laid still, holding my breath, straining to listen. The steps circled the cabin once, then stopped at the back wall, right near the bedroom. I could hear breathing, low, slow breathing. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. My hands shook under the blanket. I had my knife within reach, but what good would that do? I didn't even know what I was dealing with. The breathing continued for maybe 30 seconds, then faded. I heard more footsteps, then silence. I didn't sleep at all that night. By morning, I had made up my mind to leave. I packed everything as fast as I could. I jammed it all into my car, double-checked the cabin, and was ready to go by noon. But the car wouldn't start. Cranked, clicked, and coughed, but wouldn't turn over. I popped the hood, checked the battery terminals. Everything looked fine. I tried again. Nothing. I checked the gas gauge. Full. Then I looked underneath. My gas line had been cut. It wasn't frayed. It wasn't chewed. It was clean, like someone had sliced it with a knife. That was when I really felt fear. Not the creeping kind, the full body kind. My hands shook as I backed away from the car. I looked around me at the trees, at the empty trail leading out. I was stuck. No cell service, no satellite signal, no one to call. I was a full day's hike from the nearest road, and whoever was out there, they knew I was stuck now. I spent the rest of the day barricading the cabin. I dragged furniture in front of the doors. I jammed nails through boards and braced them against the windows. I made sure my flashlight had fresh batteries, kept my knife within reach, and loaded the flare gun. I didn't eat. I didn't drink. I sat by the window and waited. That night, they came back. This time, it was more than just footsteps. Around midnight, I heard the front door rattle, then the back door, then scratching on the walls, slow, rhythmic, almost lazy, like they were playing with me. The windows stayed shut. The boards held, but I could hear them, walking, breathing, whispering things I couldn't make out. Just noise, teeth on wood, fingers tapping. It lasted for hours. I didn't sleep. I just sat with the flare gun aimed at the door, eyes wide, heart pounding, waiting for them to try something real. They didn't. Not that night. The next morning, I made a plan. I couldn't stay in the cabin. That was obvious now. I had enough food and water to survive, sure, but I wouldn't survive them. Whoever they were, they wanted me here, trapped, scared, waiting. I couldn't play their game. So I packed my bag light, just water, food, knife, flare gun, and a printed map. I had marked the route out earlier just in case. According to the map, there was an old logging road about 5 miles south. It hadn't been used in years, but it was my best shot. If I could get to it, I could follow it to the main road and flag someone down. I left at first light. I didn't take the trail. I cut straight through the trees, using the sun and the map to keep my bearings. I moved fast, stopping only when I heard something. Once I saw movement behind me, a shape, a blur. I didn't stop to look. By mid-afternoon, I found the logging road. It was overgrown, but still passable. I followed it, heart pounding the entire time. Every crack of a branch made me flinch. Every rustle in the trees made me look back. Around dusk, I heard an engine. I scrambled toward the sound, crashed through the underbrush, and nearly fell into the road. A green pickup truck was idling there, an old man in the driver's seat. I waved him down. He braked, rolled. It wasn't planned, not really. I had been on the road for 12 hours, trying to make it across the state before dark. My back ached, my eyes felt heavy, and I was running low on caffeine and patience. I had been driving north through a thick stretch of forest road, somewhere deep in the central part of the state, where the trees stood tall and tight, casting long shadows across the two-lane blacktop. There was no cell signal, no gas stations. I hadn't seen a single other car in almost 2 hours. I was supposed to be heading toward my uncle's property. He owned some land near a lake, a ways out from civilization, where I was going to spend a few quiet days. But I'd taken a wrong turn back near the county line and hadn't realized it until I was already too far in to backtrack without running out of gas. The sun had dropped behind the trees fast, and with no light on the road and nothing but empty woods around me, I figured I had to stop and sleep somewhere before I ended up dozing off behind the wheel. That's when I saw the cabin. It wasn't right by the road. I noticed a gap in the trees, a little gravel path just wide enough for one vehicle, mostly overgrown with weeds and leaves. There was an old wooden sign half covered in moss, leaning at an angle, but no words on it anymore, just the ghost of letters that time had erased. I almost drove past it, but curiosity and desperation made me stop. I backed up and turned onto the path, tires crunching over loose gravel and branches. The path twisted through the trees for about 200 yards before opening up into a small clearing. That's when I saw the cabin. It was old but not falling apart. Weathered wood, a rusted metal roof, a front porch with a broken railing. The windows had curtains drawn on the inside. There was an outhouse a few yards off to the right, barely visible in the dimming light. No car, no lights, just the quiet hum of the woods and the last orange light of day slipping away behind the tree line. I sat in the car for a few minutes, thinking maybe this was a bad idea, but I was tired. I figured I'd just sleep in the back seat, maybe check if the cabin was unlocked just to stretch out a bit. I wasn't trying to steal anything, just needed a place to crash for a few hours before finding my way back to the highway. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out. The air was cooler now, and the forest felt thick with silence. Not the peaceful kind either. It felt like the woods were holding their breath. I walked up to the porch, boards creaking under my boots, and tried the door. It was unlocked. Inside, it smelled like dust and dry wood. The place looked like it hadn't been lived in for a long time, but someone had clearly used it. There was an old wood stove, some stacked firewood, a couple of shelves with canned food, a small table with 2 chairs, and a cot in the corner with a blanket folded on top. Nothing fancy, but it looked clean, like someone had taken care of it in a basic way. I checked every room. There were only 2. The main area and a back room with a small bed and a few cabinets. Nothing unusual. No electricity. Just the glow of my flashlight and whatever moonlight slipped through the cracks. I figured I'd crash for a few hours and head out at sunrise. I took the cot in the main room and lay down with my backpack for a pillow. It was colder than I expected, so I pulled the blanket over me. It smelled old but not awful. I listened to the sounds of the forest outside for a while. Crickets, a breeze rustling the trees, the occasional snap of a twig. Normal stuff. But then, sometime after midnight, I heard something else. It was subtle at first, just a soft scraping sound, like branches against wood. I figured it was just the wind brushing the trees against the cabin walls. But then it came again, louder this time, more deliberate. A slow, dragging sound across the porch boards, right outside the door. I sat up, heart thudding, and listened. Nothing. Silence again. I convinced myself it was probably a raccoon or some animal looking for food. I lay back down. Then came the knock. 3 soft knocks. Not loud, not rushed, just slow and careful. I froze. My breathing stopped. I didn't move for a long time. No other sounds followed. I waited, staring at the door in the dim light from my flashlight, which I'd left on the floor next to the cot. After 5 minutes, nothing. I told myself maybe it was the wind or some falling branch. I knew it didn't sound like that, but I needed to believe it if I wanted to sleep. Eventually, I dozed off again, clutching the flashlight like a weapon. When I woke up, it was still dark, but lighter than before. Maybe 4 or 5 a.m. The forest outside was gray and quiet. I decided to leave. Whatever happened last night, I didn't want to stay any longer. I packed up, opened the door, and stopped. There were footprints on the porch. Not boot prints, not shoes, bare feet. One set, darkened with mud. Long toes, deep, wide impressions. They led up to the door and then turned around, heading back toward the tree line. I looked out into the woods, but saw nothing, just trees and shadows. I followed the prints with my eyes. They disappeared into the underbrush a few feet from the clearing. I got in my car, started it up, and backed out fast. I didn't care about the bumps and branches. I just wanted out of there. I drove until I found the highway again and finally got cell signal around noon. I checked the map. I had been way off course. No cabins were listed in that area. No private campgrounds. Nothing. I tried to forget about it. Told myself it was probably a homeless person or a hermit. Something that could be explained. But a week later, I couldn't stop thinking about it. So I went back. I had to know. This time I brought a camera, a knife, and a flashlight with extra batteries. I left early in the morning and got there just after noon. The gravel path looked the same, still overgrown, still barely visible. I parked at the edge of the woods and walked the rest of the way in on foot. When I reached the clearing, the cabin was gone. Not destroyed, not burned, gone. No structure, no porch, no foundation, just a patch of flattened earth with some old boards scattered around, half buried in the dirt. The outhouse was still there, leaning and broken, but the cabin was completely missing. I walked in circles around the clearing, trying to make sense of it. I took photos, took samples, even checked the trees nearby for signs of recent movement or machinery. Nothing. No tire tracks, no footprints, no signs anyone had been there recently at all. I looked at the spot where the door used to be, the place I'd seen the footprints, the place where I'd heard those slow, soft knocks. And that's when I noticed something I hadn't seen before. In the dirt, just past the tree line, was a shallow depression. A kind of trench, maybe 2 feet wide, running along the edge of the clearing. Almost like someone had dug a perimeter. It was old, but not ancient. Maybe a year or two. Inside that shallow trench were bones. Small bones. Animal maybe, but some didn't look like any animal I could name. Long finger-like shapes. A cracked piece of jaw. Teeth. I didn't touch them. I just stared, the hair on the back of my neck rising. Something was wrong about that place. Deeply wrong. Not supernatural. Not haunted. But human. Later, I looked up old land records at the local township. That area hadn't been officially owned or developed in over 40 years. No recent structures had been registered. I even found some old survey maps. Nothing had ever been built there, according to the county. But when I asked around in town, one old man remembered something. He said that back in the 1980s, a man had gone missing in those woods. Supposedly, he'd built himself a cabin and gone off-grid. But after a few years, people stopped hearing from him. When someone finally went out to check, they said the place was abandoned. No body was found. The cabin was empty. A few months later, it was gone too. They assumed it was dismantled for wood or maybe collapsed and rotted into the ground. But no one ever went back out there again. He told me I should do the same. I wish I had listened, but I kept digging. I filed a request with the State Forestry Department for aerial photos of the area from the last few decades. When I got them, I flipped through each year, zooming in on the spot where the cabin had been. In the 1992 photo, the clearing was there and so was the cabin. Clear as day. In the 1995 photo, the cabin was gone. But in the 1994 photo, something caught my eye. There was a second structure behind the cabin. Something long and narrow, like a shed or maybe a trailer. It was gone in the next image. I couldn't explain that. I couldn't explain any of it. But one thing was clear. Someone had lived there, and someone had made sure it all disappeared. I don't talk about it much anymore. Not because I'm scared people won't believe me, but because I don't want them going out there to look for it. The forest took the cabin back. Or maybe the people who made it disappear came back for it. Either way, I've learned my lesson. If you're tired on the road, sleep in your car. Don't go wandering down strange paths. It was early November when I drove up into the northern part of Michigan to spend a week alone at a cabin I had rented off a small listing website. I wanted time away from work, away from the city, and most importantly, away from people. Things had been getting too noisy in my life. Constant emails, meetings, pressure. I felt like I was coming apart at the seams. I figured a quiet, isolated place with no phone reception and nothing around for miles would help clear my head. The listing described the place as an authentic hunting cabin, nothing fancy, but fully enclosed with a wood stove, propane for cooking, and a small solar setup for lights. I didn't need anything luxurious, just peace. That's what I thought I was going for. Took me about 7 hours to get there from home. The last 2 hours of that drive were down bumpy gravel roads that seemed to wind endlessly through thick forest. My tires kicked up leaves and small stones. There were no road signs for a long stretch, and I had to keep checking the printed directions I brought because GPS cut out a good hour earlier. Finally, after crossing an old-looking wooden bridge and passing a rusted-out truck half swallowed by weeds, I saw a clearing up ahead. The cabin sat in the middle of that clearing, low roof, unpainted wood, one window facing the front, and a small porch with a sagging chair. Behind it, tall pine trees rose like dark walls. To the left of the cabin, about 30 yards away, stood an old outhouse, gray and leaning a bit. A metal drum sat nearby, probably used for burning trash. I parked my truck off to the side and stepped out. The air was cold and clean. I stood there for a minute just breathing it in, trying to let the quiet settle into my bones. No traffic, no hum of electronics, just wind in the trees and the creak of wood as I walked up the porch and opened the door. The inside was exactly what I expected, bare floorboards, a small kitchen area with a propane burner, a wooden table with 2 mismatched chairs, and a narrow cot in the corner with a thick wool blanket. There were hooks on the walls for hanging gear and a wood stove that looked solid but ancient. A metal box beside it held logs and kindling. There was a small storage closet at the back, and next to it, a ladder that led up to a low loft with just enough room to sleep if I didn't mind bumping my head. I unpacked most of my things quickly. Sleeping bag, canned food, a camp stove for backup, water jugs, lanterns, and a rifle. I wasn't hunting, but I didn't come out here unarmed either. Black bears were still around this late in the season, and if something worse showed up, well, it didn't hurt to be prepared. The first day was uneventful. I split some firewood, walked around the area, and got a sense of the trails that led off into the woods. I noticed old tire tracks in the dirt not far from the cabin, half faded, like someone had been there weeks ago. I figured maybe it was a hunter or someone else who had stayed here recently. No big deal. I cooked a simple meal and settled in by the fire as darkness fell early, like it always does in the fall. I read a little by lantern light, then went up to the loft to sleep. The wind picked up during the night and whistled through the trees, and I heard a few thumps on the roof, probably branches or pine cones. Still, I couldn't shake a strange tension in my chest, even though there was no clear reason for it. On the second day, I explored deeper into the woods. I followed a path that twisted around a small pond, now half frozen and covered in brown leaves. I found deer tracks, a few claw marks on a tree trunk, maybe from a black bear, and something else that gave me pause. An old campsite probably abandoned for years. The remains of a fire ring were still there, and the rusted frame of what looked like a folding chair. The air felt heavier there. I didn't stay long. Back at the cabin, I noticed something strange. One of the water jugs I left on the porch had been knocked over. It was on its side, lid unscrewed, water soaked into the wood. At first, I thought maybe I had just not screwed it on tight, or maybe wind knocked it. But the porch was covered, and it hadn't been that windy. I chalked it up to my own clumsiness and didn't think much of it. Still, I moved the rest of the supplies inside. The third day started fine. I had coffee over the fire and hiked a different trail that climbed up a steep hill with a view of the woods below. It was quiet. No animals, no birds, not even the sound of branches breaking. Just the cold and the silence. I remember thinking how peaceful it was, but also how fragile that feeling was. Like if something broke it, it would break hard. When I came back in the afternoon, I noticed fresh prints in the mud near the side of the cabin. Not boot prints, bare feet, human. They were small and narrow, like a man's foot, not a child's, but they were bare. In November, out here, no vehicle tracks, no other signs of someone being nearby. Just those prints, circling part of the cabin and leading toward the woods, then vanishing into the underbrush. I stared at them for a long time. My first thought was that someone might be squatting nearby, maybe a hermit, maybe someone unstable. I walked the area slowly, my rifle slung over my shoulder, but I found nothing. No signs of a nearby camp, no movement in the trees. I went back inside and locked the door even though I didn't think it would do much. That night, I slept on the main floor with the rifle beside me. I didn't go up to the loft. The fire in the stove crackled quietly, but outside, I kept hearing faint sounds. Branches snapping, soft shuffling footsteps in the leaves. Never close, just distant enough to make me second-guess whether I heard anything at all. On the fourth day, I found something that made me feel real fear. I went to the outhouse in the morning and noticed something scratched into the inside of the door. It wasn't there before. 5 tally marks, dug deep into the wood. Fresh. The grooves were clean, splintered at the edges. I ran my finger over them. They'd been done with something sharp, knife maybe, and it meant one thing to me. Someone had been here after me, close enough to use the same outhouse. I didn't stay out there long. I rushed back into the cabin and checked everything. Nothing was missing. Nothing seemed moved, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I considered leaving early, but I told myself it might just be paranoia. Maybe the scratches were old, and I just hadn't noticed them. I wanted to believe that. I needed to. That night, it snowed a little, just enough to dust the clearing and the porch. I stayed up late with the lantern off, just listening. Around midnight, I heard footsteps outside, slow, deliberate, crunching through the snow. They circled the cabin. I sat completely still, not even breathing, rifle pointed at the door. The footsteps paused at the porch. I heard a soft creak, the porch boards, then silence. I waited until morning to open the door. The prints were there, a full set circling the building and stopping at the steps. Bare feet again, long strides, no shoes. I followed them to the edge of the trees. They just stopped. No turnaround, no sign of retreat. They just ended. I spent most of the day inside after that. I kept the fire low, didn't cook anything, didn't even move much. I didn't want whoever or whatever was out there to know I was inside. I tried to stay calm, but I kept thinking of those tallies. 5 marks, like a count. Was I number 5? Was it a countdown? On the 5th night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat in the corner with my back to the wall, rifle in hand. It was colder now, and the snow came down harder. I barely moved. Around 3 in the morning, I heard something, soft tapping on the glass window. Not a knock, not even hard enough to break. Just the gentlest tap, like fingernails. Then nothing. I didn't look. I didn't want to see. I just sat there, heart thudding, barely blinking. The fire burned out sometime before dawn, and I let it. I sat in the cold, waiting. By morning, I'd made my decision. I was done. I packed fast, stuffing everything into the truck without care. I didn't eat. I didn't check anything. I just got in, turned the key, and left the cabin behind. I drove back down that long gravel road faster than I should have, tires sliding on the snow-covered turns. I didn't stop once. I didn't tell anyone about what happened. Not really. I mentioned to a friend that I cut my trip short because the weather turned bad. That was true enough. But every night since, I've thought about that tapping, about those footprints, about how they just stopped. A few weeks later, I looked up the listing again, curiosity or maybe something else. The site was gone. Not just the cabin listing, everything. The domain didn't even exist anymore. I've thought about it a lot, what I went through. I've tried to come up with a logical explanation. A local off-the-grid person who liked to mess with people. Someone squatting in the woods. A crazy guy who didn't want others nearby. Maybe even just some drifter who happened to find my cabin and wanted to scare me off. It's all possible. But what sticks with me more than anything else is how careful they were. No confrontation. No vandalism. Just subtle things. A jug. I'd rented the cabin to get away from people. That was the whole idea. A place deep in the woods of northern Maine, far enough off the grid that I'd lose cell service 10 minutes before I even reached the driveway. No work calls, no internet, no distractions. Just me, a couple weeks off from my IT job, some trail maps, and a stocked cooler. The listing said it was a hunting cabin, though it hadn't been used for that in years. The photos showed it was basic, single-story, no frills, not even a real bathroom, but it had a roof, a wood stove, and a cot. That's all I wanted. I packed everything carefully. Water, food, a camp stove, extra fuel, warm clothes, trail boots, a sleeping bag good down to 0, backup batteries, even a flare gun I'd never used before. I wasn't new to the woods, but I also wasn't arrogant about it. I'd done solo hikes in the Appalachians, some light camping in the Rockies, and several weekend getaways in Vermont during the fall. But this time felt different before it even began. Not for any spooky reason, just more isolated. It was almost 5 hours of driving from where I lived in Massachusetts. The last 20 miles were on dirt roads that seemed to change direction without warning. No signage, no markers, no other cars. I used the printed directions the owner emailed me, which felt ancient but accurate. The final stretch curved sharply downhill, dipped between 2 steep hills, and then opened into a wide clearing where the cabin stood, surrounded on 3 sides by thick woods. A narrow trail led off to the west, disappearing into pines that swallowed the light. The air was dead still when I parked. No birds, no rustling, just quiet and trees. The cabin itself was smaller than I expected, more weathered, paint flaked from the edges. A dented metal chimney stuck out of the roof like a snapped antenna. I walked around first, checking everything like I always do. The door had a simple padlock, which I unlocked with the code the owner gave me. Inside, it was clean but bare. Wooden floor, a steel cot, a single table, 1 chair, a couple of shelves with dust-covered lanterns, and a metal stove in the corner. There was no insulation that I could see, just old wood planks for walls. I lit the stove first. It was cold already even though it was mid-September. Night temperatures in this area dropped fast. The woodpile outside was dry, thank God, and I got a good fire going within 30 minutes. I set up my sleeping bag on the cot, organized my gear, and then stepped outside with a beer to watch the sun go down behind the pines. There was a strange feeling in that clearing. Not threatening, not eerie, just still, as if everything was waiting. The quiet made my thoughts louder. Took me a few hours to settle in, and when night came, it came hard. I had a lantern inside, but I didn't use it much. I liked the dark when it was just me. The first night was uneventful. I woke up cold once around 3 a.m., fed the fire, then went back to sleep. No weird dreams, no scratching at the windows, no animals sniffing around the cabin, just silence and blackness. It wasn't until the 3rd day that something began to feel off. I'd been hiking the trail behind the cabin most of that day. It wasn't marked on the official maps I brought, but the dirt path was clear enough. It snaked through the forest in long curves and gentle climbs, probably used by hunters years ago. I followed it for nearly 2 hours before deciding to turn back. I'd brought a small day pack with food, water, and a compass, so I wasn't worried about getting lost. But on the way back, I noticed something strange. About halfway to the cabin, I passed a section I didn't remember. A small dip in the trail with 2 boulders on either side and a broken tree laying across the ground. I was sure I hadn't seen it on the way up. I stopped and looked around. Nothing had changed. No sudden wind, no strange smells. But I had the uneasy feeling you get when you return to a place and something's out of place. Like coming home and finding a chair pulled out that you didn't touch. Back at the cabin, I convinced myself I must have missed it the first time. I made dinner on the small propane stove and read for a bit by the lantern light. That night, I woke again at 3 a.m., same as the night before. I don't know what woke me. There was no noise, no sudden dream, just an instinct that told me to sit up. I waited, holding my breath, listening. The fire had died almost completely. The air was cold enough that I could see my breath. I threw a few logs in the stove and lit them carefully, keeping my movements slow and quiet. I remember glancing at the window next to the cot and having the intense, irrational feeling that someone was standing just out of sight. I didn't go to the window. I didn't move after lighting the fire. I crawled back into my sleeping bag and faced the wall. I told myself it was nothing, but it felt like something had been there, watching, waiting for me to move. The next morning, I walked the trail again. I had to prove to myself that the boulders had always been there, that the broken tree had fallen months ago, not hours. But when I got to the spot, the tree was gone. The boulders were still there, but the tree I clearly remembered laying across the trail was upright, rooted even. I stood staring at it for a long time. My mind tried to explain it. Maybe I mistook a different log for a fallen tree. Maybe the tree had never fallen. Maybe I was sleep deprived, but none of it felt right. The ground around the base of the tree was disturbed. Fresh dirt, too loose, not packed. It looked like something had recently been moved, either dug up or buried. I bent down and ran my fingers through it. The soil was cold. No tracks, no tools, no signs of animals. I didn't follow the trail beyond that point again. That night, I locked the cabin door for the first time. Not that it would stop anything. It was just a thin piece of plywood with an old bolt. I kept my flashlight on my chest and slept with my boots still half-laced. Around midnight, I heard movement. Not far off. Something brushing through the dry leaves behind the cabin. Not fast, not animal-like. Slow, deliberate, like someone pacing. I sat up, clicked off the flashlight, and listened. It stopped after a few minutes. Then I heard it again, this time on the opposite side of the cabin. Something circled the cabin 3 times that night. No knocking, no sounds at the windows, just the steady movement of footsteps dragging through the brush, pausing, then moving again. I didn't sleep. The next morning, I packed my gear. I told myself I was just being paranoid, but I also knew something was watching me. The woods around the cabin weren't right anymore. I couldn't explain it, but the silence felt deeper, heavier, like the forest was pressing in from all sides. I locked the door, even though I didn't plan on returning, and walked to my car. It wouldn't start. The battery was dead, completely. Not a single light on the dash. It was a new battery. I'd driven the car every day before the trip. It had never given me problems. I opened the hood and checked the connections. Nothing looked loose. No corrosion. I tried the ignition again. Nothing. I considered walking to the main road, but it was at least 15 miles back, and I didn't know which fork I'd taken to get here. I hadn't marked it. I'd relied on printed directions and hadn't thought to log GPS coordinates. There was no cell service, no Wi-Fi. I was stuck. I decided to spend one more night, just to rest, to think. I still had food and water. The cabin wasn't safe, but it was shelter. I kept the fire low and slept lightly, waking at every sound. At some point, I heard movement on the roof. Slow, measured steps, pacing. Then silence. Then a thump above me, as if something heavy had been dropped. The first light, I stepped outside. The woods looked normal, but on the roof, there were marks. Scrapes in the dust, lines carved into the soft pine boards. I climbed up to get a better look, using a fallen branch as a makeshift ladder. There were boot prints, human, a size or two larger than mine. Deep tread, not old, clear as day. I jumped down and didn't go back inside. I followed the trail west, hoping to find another road or a hunting shack. Anything. I walked for hours. Every bend looked the same. Pines, dead leaves, stones. Then, somehow, I was back at the same spot with the two boulders. The tree was still upright, but now the ground around it was more disturbed, almost like it had been dug again. A deep hollow in the shape of a shallow grave. There was something white sticking out of the dirt. I reached down and pulled. It was cloth, dirty canvas, like a jacket or a tarp. I tugged harder and uncovered part of a sleeve. Inside it was a bone, thin, cracked, weathered, not an animal's. I dropped it and ran. I ran until my legs cramped, until my lungs burned, until I fell face first into the leaves. When I looked up, I was staring at my own boot prints going in the wrong direction. I was running in circles. By nightfall, I gave up and returned to the cabin. I didn't light the fire. I didn't sleep. I sat against the door with the flare gun in my lap and listened. I wasn't looking for anything special when I booked the cabin. I just needed quiet. I had quit my job the month before. Not in a dramatic way, just one of those decisions that grows on you like rust. Every morning for years I'd woken up to the same digital clock, dressed in the same half-dark, taken the same exact route to the office where I spent most of my waking life in a chair, facing a monitor I could draw from memory. I hit a point where I realized I hadn't done anything real in years. I hadn't built anything, hadn't touched the ground, hadn't even been truly alone without distractions. I wanted silence. I wanted some version of peace I hadn't felt in forever. The cabin I rented was on the edge of a national forest in northern Montana. Closest town was about 30 minutes down a winding road. Not even a real town, just a single gas station, a diner, and a place that sold basic groceries. The guy who rented me the cabin owned about 100 acres of forest and open land. He had a website where he listed a few different spots, but I picked the one farthest from the rest. A simple wood cabin with no electricity, no running water, no cell signal. Just a propane stove, a wood-burning fireplace, and a hand pump for water. The pictures showed it nestled near the base of a steep ridge, surrounded by pine and spruce, a field behind it, and deep woods beyond. I arrived in late September. The drive-in was long but beautiful. Bright yellow aspens, fading green firs, and patches of red brush in the valleys. The dirt road got worse the closer I got. At one point, I had to stop and move a fallen branch myself. When I finally saw the cabin, it looked exactly like I wanted it to. Small, weathered, quiet, and forgotten. Just a rectangle of rough wood planks, a tin roof, a porch with a single chair, and a stack of firewood beside the door. There was an outhouse about 20 yards behind it, and a trail leading into the woods, though it looked overgrown and hadn't been used in a while. Inside was one room, a cot, a table with 2 chairs, a shelf with some dusty pots, a few oil lanterns, a small chest with extra blankets, and a heavy iron stove for cooking and heat. The windows had old curtains but no blinds. The floor creaked when I walked on it, but everything felt solid. No insulation, just the raw wall planks. It smelled like old wood and cold air. I spent the first day settling in, collected some wood, tested the stove, lit the lanterns. I ate canned soup that night and read from a paperback I'd brought until I was too tired to keep my eyes open. The quiet out there was real, the kind that makes your ears ring at first. No engines, no buzz from wires, not even a ticking clock. Just the wind in the trees and the occasional crack of wood shifting in the stove. The first few days were perfect. I hiked around during the day, followed some animal trails, tried to sketch the landscape a bit. I wasn't much of an artist, but it gave me something to do. Nights were long, but not uncomfortable. I got used to the dark, to the slow, quiet rhythm of the forest. I felt like I was shrinking back into something simpler, more grounded. Around the 4th night, I heard something outside just after I got into bed. It wasn't much, just a soft crunch of dried leaves, like a step. Then silence, then another. My first thought was deer. I'd seen a few during the day, and they wandered everywhere. But the steps didn't sound like a deer. They didn't sound quick or light, just slow, deliberate crunches. Not close, but not far either. I sat up, listening. Nothing for a while. Then one more crunch. I stood, careful not to step on the squeakiest part of the floor. The window by the bed looked out toward the woods. I peeled back the curtain. It was pitch black beyond the porch. I waited. My eyes adjusted a bit, but I didn't see anything. No movement, no shape, no glow from eyes. It stopped eventually. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a bear. They wandered too, but it kept me awake longer than I'd like to admit. Next morning, I walked around the area near the cabin. I didn't see anything unusual. No tracks I could clearly make out, but the leaves made it hard to tell. Everything was covered in a layer of dry pine needles, sticks, and decaying leaves. Still, I felt a little less sure of things. That night, I kept the fire going a little longer. On the 6th day, I followed that old trail into the woods. I packed a day bag, just some snacks, water, a flashlight, knife, and jacket. The trail was faint but still traceable. About 30 minutes in, I came across what looked like an old shack. It wasn't on any of the maps the cabin owner sent me. Just a slanted square structure tucked between some thick trees. The walls were mossy and rotting. The roof was caved in on one side. I didn't go in, just stood and looked at it. Something about it felt wrong. Not scary exactly, just forgotten in the worst kind of way. It didn't feel like part of the rest of the forest. It felt like something left behind that no one wanted to deal with. I marked a tree near it with a strip of orange tape from my bag and headed back before dark. That night, I heard the steps again. This time they were closer, not directly outside, but maybe 10 or 15 feet from the cabin. Still slow. One pause, then another. They circled around the back. I didn't move. I lay there in bed, heart pounding. I'd left the lantern burning low, so the shadows were soft, flickering across the ceiling. Then the steps stopped. I stayed frozen for almost an hour, waiting. No knock, no voice, no scratching, just silence. Eventually I got up and slipped my boots on. I held the knife in my right hand and cracked the door open with my left. I stepped out and stood on the porch. My breath made small clouds in the air. The moon was half full, casting enough light to see the edges of the field and the trees beyond. Nothing moved, no sound at all. I walked around the cabin once. Nothing. No tracks I could see, just the usual forest floor. I went back in and locked the door. The next morning I found something. Behind the cabin, maybe 5 feet from the wall, there was a pile of stacked rocks. Maybe 6 or 7 flat stones, each one smaller than the one below it, like a crude tower. I hadn't seen it before. I would have noticed something like that. It wasn't natural. Someone had built it. The rocks were clean, not covered in moss or dirt, like they'd been picked out and placed carefully. I knocked it over without thinking. I don't know why. I just didn't like seeing it there. I kicked the stones aside and walked back to the porch. That day, I didn't go far. Just cut some more wood and stayed close. I tried reading, but I couldn't focus. That night, the steps came back. Closer again. I didn't light the lantern this time. I sat in the dark, listening. They came from the front this time. I heard them stop on the porch. The boards creaked under the weight. Just once. Then silence. I held my breath. The door was locked, but the window next to it wasn't thick. I sat there with the knife, eyes straining in the dark, every sound sharper than usual. I thought I heard something brush against the wall. A hand maybe, or fabric, but it was so soft I wasn't sure. Eventually the sound faded. I stayed up the rest of the night. Every now and then I thought I heard something out there. Breathing, maybe, but I couldn't trust my own ears anymore. At dawn, I opened the door slowly. On the porch, where the single chair had been, there was a dead squirrel. His body was laid flat on the seat. Its belly had been sliced open, and its insides removed, neatly, like someone had taken their time. There was no blood on the chair, just the body. The fur around its head was matted, like it had been pressed down or held. I stepped back inside and locked the door. I sat at the table for a long time. I knew someone was messing with me. It wasn't a game. It wasn't kids or a prank. I hadn't seen a single other person since I arrived. There weren't even tire tracks on the road. I was isolated in the truest sense, and someone else was out there watching, moving around at night, leaving things behind. I thought about leaving that day, packing up and driving back to town. But I didn't. I don't know why. Maybe I didn't want to let whoever it was scare me off. Maybe I wanted to catch them. Or maybe I just didn't want to admit I was scared. The next night was the worst. I didn't sleep. I sat in the dark, fire out, knife in hand, waiting. Around 2 a.m, I heard something again. Not steps this time. Breathing. Right outside the window behind me. Just slow, steady breaths. I didn't move. It stayed there for maybe a full minute. Then silence. I didn't hear it walk away. Just nothing. After an hour, I stood and looked out. The moon was bright enough now that I could see the tree line. And in that moment, I saw a shape standing there, just beyond the reach of the moonlight. Tall, still, facing the cabin. I blinked, looked again, and it was gone. Next morning, I packed up. I didn't clean. I didn't fold the blankets. I just threw I had been renting cabins off and on for years, mostly in off-season months when the rates dropped and the woods were quieter. I wasn't looking for solitude because I was some poetic soul or anything like that. I just liked the silence. My job was remote, writing technical manuals for a logistics company, and as long as I had a stable internet connection and electricity, I could work from pretty much anywhere. So, every once in a while, I'd drive out into the middle of nowhere, stay for a couple weeks, work by day, hike in the afternoons, drink at night, and just breathe air that didn't smell like car exhaust and burnt coffee. The cabin I booked this time was somewhere up in the Adirondacks, northern New York. It sat right off a trailhead, about 40 minutes from the nearest town, and was owned by an older guy who didn't even live in the state anymore. He had it listed on a site that looked like it hadn't been updated since 2006. There were 5 grainy photos, no reviews, and a short description that just said, remote, off-grid, generator power, well water, no neighbors for miles. That was exactly what I wanted. I wasn't looking for luxury or Instagram aesthetics, just peace. I drove in late on a Thursday afternoon, the sky cloud-covered and dim, not quite raining but always threatening to. My phone had lost signal about 20 minutes before I reached the dirt turnoff that led to the property. The road was deeply rutted and slick from earlier rain. Trees arched overhead like they were growing toward each other, darkening the already dull sky. I had to ease my little crossover SUV over roots and rocks, crawling at 5 miles an hour. Finally, after what felt like way too long, I spotted the cabin. It wasn't much. Single story, 1 window in the front, wood-paneled with a slightly tilted metal roof. There was a fire pit surrounded by old stumps that served as seats, a metal rack for chopping wood, and what looked like an outhouse further back in the trees. The porch sagged in the middle, and the railing looked like it had been kicked or hit with something heavy, cracked in the center and held together with bungee cords. Still, it was standing, and the lockbox code the owner gave me worked. Inside was small but clean. Just 1 room, bed, table, kitchenette, tiny bathroom, and 1 door leading to a back room that looked like it had once been a pantry, but now held a water tank, generator switch, and shelves of dusty cans. There was no Wi-Fi, but I didn't care. I had my satellite hotspot, which I set up immediately. It worked fine. I ran a speed test, downloaded some emails, then shut my laptop and unpacked. I planned on staying for 12 days. The first 3 days were uneventful. I settled into a routine, waking up early, making instant coffee on the propane stove, working until the early afternoon, then taking long hikes along the narrow trails that spiderwebbed out from the cabin. I'd walk for hours, barely seeing a soul. There were signs of human life, old trail markers, faded flagging tape, boot prints hardened in mud, but I never ran into anyone. On the 4th night, I woke up around 2:30 in the morning because something was tapping the side of the cabin. It was a light, irregular sound, not like wind, more like something small and hard flicking against the wall. I lay still in the dark for a long time, listening, trying to figure out what it was. Trees, maybe? A loose branch? Then the sound stopped. I stayed awake for another hour, but nothing else happened. I told myself it was just the wind. That's what it usually was. The next morning, I walked the perimeter of the cabin just to check. I didn't see anything strange. A few pine cones were scattered around the foundation, but no big branches or anything leaning against the wood. I went for a hike, came back, worked some more, and forgot about it. The next night, same time, around 2:30 again, I woke up to the same tapping. This time I sat up immediately. I couldn't explain why, but it sounded closer, like it was hitting the wall right behind the bed. I didn't have any weapons with me, but I grabbed the flashlight and moved toward the window. I didn't turn the light on, just stood there in the dark, breathing slowly, heart pounding. I waited. The tapping stopped again, just like before. In the morning, I found nothing new. No prints, no marks on the wall. It was starting to feel like my brain was playing tricks on me. I chalked it up to animals, maybe squirrels or birds or something in the eaves. The weather had warmed slightly, and maybe that was enough to bring out more wildlife. But I couldn't shake the unease that had crept into my gut. That afternoon, I didn't hike. I stayed close, cleaned up the inside of the cabin, read an old paperback I found in the cabinet. Around sunset, I decided to chop some wood for the fire pit. I grabbed the axe and started splitting the few logs stacked near the rack. After about 20 minutes, I noticed something odd. Across the clearing, on the far edge where the trees thickened again, a small piece of orange fabric fluttered from a branch about 5 feet up. It wasn't flagging tape. It looked more like a strip of clothing, like it had been torn off and stuck there. I left the axe and walked over to it. Sure enough, it was a piece of nylon, maybe from a jacket or backpack. It was dirty and faded, but I could still tell it had once been bright orange. I looked around. There was no obvious path nearby, just dense underbrush. Still, someone had to have come through here, and not too long ago. The fabric wasn't sun-bleached or torn to shreds. That night, I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up, checking the clock, listening for sounds. At one point, I thought I heard something brush the porch. A creak, maybe, but it didn't repeat. When I finally did drift off, I dreamed of being watched from the trees, of narrow eyes behind bark and bushes. The next morning, I felt hungover even though I hadn't had anything to drink. My nerves were frayed. I couldn't sit still. I took another hike just to burn energy, heading west this time, trying to follow the slope of the land. I ended up stumbling onto an old trail that didn't show up on any maps. A narrow, overgrown line that looked like it hadn't been used in years. Still, the way the grass was bent and some of the brambles were broken told me someone had walked through it recently. Within the past few days, at least. I followed it for about 20 minutes until it just stopped near a dry creek bed. Nothing around. No campsites, no signs of people. When I turned back, I kept hearing small noises behind me. Twigs snapping, faint rustling. Every time I stopped to listen, the forest went still. When I got back to the cabin, I locked the door for the first time since I arrived. That night, something knocked on the wall. It wasn't tapping anymore. It was a knock. 3 slow, spaced out thuds. Then silence. I didn't move. I just lay there in the dark, breathing through my nose, trying to stay as still as possible. I could feel my pulse in my fingertips. My ears were straining, listening for any follow-up sound. Footsteps, another knock, anything. Nothing came. In the morning, I found boot prints behind the cabin. They were clear in the damp earth, about a size 10 or 11, maybe. The heel tread was worn down, probably old hiking boots. They led from the woods, stopped at the wall behind the bed, then turned around and disappeared back into the trees. There were no prints near the front door. Whoever it was hadn't approached from the road or the trail. They had come from the deep woods, visited that one wall, and left. I stood staring at them for a long time, holding the axe in one hand, not really sure what to do. My instinct told me to leave, just pack up and go. But part of me didn't want to overreact. Maybe it was a hiker who got lost or confused. Maybe someone who saw the cabin and approached without thinking. But that didn't make sense. Who knocks on a random wall at 2:30 in the morning and then walks away? I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat up in the only chair, with the axe beside me, lights off, listening. I stayed that way until dawn. No knocks, no sounds, just silence. The next night, it happened again. Same knock, same spot, same rhythm. This time, I ran outside with the flashlight and the axe, heart pounding so loud I could barely hear myself think. I shined the light everywhere, into the trees, across the clearing, into the brush behind the cabin. Nothing, no movement, no person, but there were fresh prints again, right where the old ones had been. I made a decision. I was leaving the next day. When morning came, I loaded the car as quickly as I could. It was still early, around 7 a.m., fog still low across the treetops. I checked everything twice. Before getting in the driver's seat, I looked back one last time, and I saw something that made my stomach drop. There was a camera lens peeking out from one of the trees about 40 feet away. It was wedged into a low fork of a pine tree, partly hidden by moss and leaves, but clearly there. A trail cam. I walked to it and found it strapped tightly to the trunk, pointing directly at the cabin. It was weathered and camouflaged, not easy to spot unless you were looking. I yanked it down. The memory card was still inside. I threw it into the car and drove away fast, bouncing over the ruts, not caring if I cracked a